It's at this point I realise that the front camera on a phone reverses whatever I show to you. Well, it basically adds up to, I can see this book properly, and you can't. Anyway, I've been meaning to do this for months. Hello, Carl. Chapter 1. You'll probably get Chapter 2 in a few miles' time, because I'm on a bike ride at the moment. Dangerous arrivals. Oh, thank you, wind. Dangerous. Hang on, I'll flip camera and then you'll be able to see it. Damn bloody wind. Hang on. Dangerous arrivals. If I could find a way of holding the book, I'd read it. With a strange groaning sound, the blue police box appeared from nowhere. A very small, very pretty, fair-haired girl came out and looked cautiously around. She was in a dimly lit, metal-walled enclosure, and the air was full of strange smells. A tall, white-haired man, elegant in velvet smoking jacket and ruffled shirt, followed her out of the police box, locking doors behind him. "I tell you, there's no need to be suspicious, Joe. I've been here before, and the air's perfectly..." He sniffed. "Fresh," he concluded on a rather less certain note. Joe Grant looked indignantly at the doctor. Really, she'd only herself to blame. After the terrifying adventures of the three doctors, the Time Lords, the Doctor's mysterious, all-powerful superiors, had rewarded him by restoring his ability to travel in time and space in the TARDIS. As eager as a child with a new toy, the Doctor had persuaded Joe to accompany him on what he called a little test flight to a very attractive-sounding planet called Metabelius 3. Joe looked around her. "Lakes like blue sapphires," he says. She muttered. "Jewelled deserts and mountains of blue crystal," he says. She turned back to the Doctor. "It's hot, it's dark, and it smells." The Doctor sniffed. No doubt about it, she was... Turn page. I don't know. She was right. That's very odd. "Sort of farmy," added Joe. The Doctor sniffed again, and subjected the evidence of his nose to a rapid analysis. "Nothing to worry about. Gaseous sulfates in fairly low concentration." He rubbed his chin. "Fairly odd that, Joe. I assure you that last time I was here, the air was like wine." Joe gave him another look. "Doctor, are you sure we're where you think we are? Can you really drive the TARDIS properly without the Time Lords helping you?" "Oh, thank you, nearby cow. My dear Joe," the Doctor said huffily, "I don't drive the TARDIS, I program it. And according to the program, this is Metabelius 3, famous blue planet in the Actian galaxy." Before Joe could reply, she became aware of a steady thump, 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 filling the air around them. "We're in some kind of machine," she said. "And it's moving." "You're right. Well, come on." Joe hung back. Where are we going?" "To find out where we are." "I thought you knew that." "Well, I do. I just want to convince you, that's all." They picked their way through the semi-darkness, which seemed to be filled with mysterious-shaped lumpy objects, most of them with sharp edges. There was a sudden flurry ahead, and Joe clutched the Doctor's arm. Something moved. The sounds died down, and they pressed cautiously on. They came to a wooden pen with feathered shapes clucking inside. Joe laughed. "Oh, it's chickens." Solemnly, the Doctor bowed before the cage. "Greetings, we come as friends." "Doctor, what are you doing?" "When you've travelled as much as I have, Joe, you'll learn not to jump to conclusions. These look like chickens, but they could be the dominant life form on this planet." The Doctor leaned over the pen. "Greetings," he said again. There was no reply. "Try clucking," suggested Joe. Before he could reply, she went on, "Doctor, these things not only look like chickens, they are chickens." "And what about this?" She pointed to the side of a nearby crate. The doctor looked. Despite the gloom, it was possible to make out stenciled capital letters that read, "Singapore." "The Actian galaxy," you said. Taken aback but not yet defeated, the doctor looked around. Nearby, a ladder led up into the darkness above them. "Come on, Joe," he said, and started to climb. Shaking her head at his obstinacy, Joe followed, pausing only to say a quick "goodbye" at the chickens, and they clucked back at her. At the top of the ladder was a hatch. The doctor lifted it. Behind him on the ladder, Joe peered through the gap. She saw decking, a rail, more cargo hatches, and an Indian seaman in shabby overalls walking past. "Metabelius be blowed," she whispered. "This is just an ordinary old cargo ship, Doctor. You've landed us back on Earth." As the terrifying adventure which followed was to prove, Joe had never been more wrong in her life. Meanwhile, more arrivals taking place. Turns page, fights wind. The spaceport of the capital city on the planet called Inter Minor was baking in the heat of the planet's twin suns. It was a busy, colourful scene as the massive cargo rockets loaded and unloaded in their separate bays. Ground cars and cargo trains scurried to and fro like ants at the feet of the towering metal mountains of the great space rockets. Cursing and sweating, the functionaries worked steadily away, loading and unloading the cargo. Capital City was in the middle of a boom. By decree of President Zarb, the planet's new ruler, Inter Minor had emerged from its long self-imposed seclusion and was busily trading with other planets in its galaxy. Many years ago, the planet had been ravaged by space plague brought in by a traveller from some foreign planet. In a hysterical overreaction, the Interminorians had cut themselves off completely from all other planets, forbidding both travel and commerce. After years of bitter political struggle, the new Progressive Party, led by President Zarb, had come to power, and Inter Minor had opened up its frontiers. President Zarb hoped by this measure to relieve some of the pressures on Minorian society. His other plans included a gradual improvement in the lot of functionaries. This meant persuading the official caste to give up some of their many privileges, an undertaking which was provoking bitter resistance. The strangest thing of all about this strange world of Inter Minor was the fact that its people had been divided for so long into different social classes that they'd gradually evolved into two different species. The largest class was that of the functionaries. They were short, stocky, with coarse, lumpy, unfinished features. They looked as if they'd been slapped together out of rough clay by a rather poor sculptor. They wore rough, serviceable clothing in heavy-duty plastic. Their function was to work, food, and sleep. That was a functionary's life. For generations, they had accepted this fate uncomplainingly, but now things were beginning to change. There was the ruling caste, the officials. They were mostly tall, thin, grey-faced, grey-robed, grey-minded for the most part. Officials' code insisted on rigid formality, with all display of emotion totally suppressed. They were the officials. Rulers by right and custom. Not all, of course, had utterly closed minds. President Zarb and his supporters were aware of the necessity for change, but the bulk of officials were set in their old ways. They had accepted Zarb only because they hoped he would save them from revolution. A thunderous rumble shook the spaceport as yet another cargo rocket descended slowly on its pad. As soon as touchdown was complete, a cargo chute was connected to its main hatch, and an assortment of goods began tumbling down to be seized by waiting functionaries, hauled onto cargo trains and driven from the spaceport. From a viewing map, two officials watched the progress with gloomy disdain. Their names were Calic and Orum. Calic's bored manner, with concealed fierce intelligence and burning ambition, while Orm's masked only complacent foolishness. Calic was small and wiry, while Orm had a tendency to plumpness. It was Calic who spoke first. The cargo rocket we were ordered to meet has arrived. Like all officials, he had no inhibitions about stating the obvious. Orm nodded gravely. One must prepare oneself to go and encounter these aliens. The last word came out of a hiss of distaste. Calic sighed. Reluctantly, one agrees. Two grey figures began descending the ramp into teeming confusion of the spaceport. Meanwhile, something very strange was happening at the unloading of the rocket. On the cargo chute had appeared two unmistakably humanoid figures, arms and legs waving wildly as they tumbled down the chute with other containers. At the bottom they scrambled to their feet, waving away functionaries who looked quite capable of loading them onto the cargo train without a second glance. First to reach the ground was a middle-aged, middle-sized humanoid clad in tattered gold finery. Boots, tunic, tights, cloak had all been magnificent, but like its wearer had seen better days. The humanoid, by race, a Lerman, by name, Vorg, dusted himself down, gazing around him with keen, alert eyes under fierce, bushy eyebrows, and stroking an equally bushy moustache. Beside him, a moment later, Sherna, an attractive young female Lerman, her clothes too were ornate, but worn, and the many neat darns and patches showed a desperate attempt to keep up appearances. Sherna hit the ground in a flaming temper. Never a girl to hide her feelings, she lost no time in letting Vorg know it. Top of the bill, he says, she cried dramatically. Look around at the hot, dusty spaceport. Treated like a star, he says. Sherna drew a deep breath. She had plenty more to say. Before she could get into her stride, Vorg yelled, Oh no, the scope! A gaudily decorated cylindrical object was tumbling down the chute. With other cargo, Vorg pushed aside a functionary, caught hold of the scope and started lowering it gently to the ground. Come on, Sherna, help me, he yelled. This thing's our living, remember? Between them, they managed to wrestle the scope off the chute and over to a small alcove under one of the ramps. The scope was tallish, fattish, cylinder. Just, hang on. Whoop, thank you, wind. Whoa. Cylinder, just under the size of a man. On top was an elaborate control panel inset with rows of lights and switches. Viewing apertures were inserted at eye level all round. There was a maintenance and service panel low on one side. Flashing colours with elaborate ornamentation gave the scope the look of something between a jukebox and a what the butler saw machine. And indeed the scope was a kind of peep show, although of a very elaborate and unusual kind. Unlike its owners, the scope had an air of seedy magnificence about it. It was a technological wonder that had come down in the world. Vorg was checking it over. It was a temperamental machine, and the journey might have upset it. When Sherna jabbed at his elbow in his Look out, here they come. Vorg looked. Two grey-robed figures were threading their way through the crowds towards them. Vorg saw how differentially the brawny functionaries moved aside for them. Immediately he assumed the humble, ingratiating smile that was his inevitable response to any kind of authority. Vorg's preliminary encounter with the Minorian official Dom was to be temporarily delayed. A disturbance had broken out in the next cargo bay. One of the functionaries had stopped work and had climbed up onto a ramp. This in itself was a serious offence. The raised ramps leading up to the upper city were only for use of officials. Worse still, the functionary was daring to make some kind of speech, distracting his fellows from their work. As if fascinated by this audacity, more and more functionaries were drifting away from their work to swell the gathering crowd beneath the ramp. Vorg and Sherna could understand nothing of the functionary's guttural speech, but judging from the growls of agreement, the crowd was on side. Sherna glanced at the two nearby officials to see how they were taking all this. To her horror, she saw that one of them had produced a blaster from beneath his robes. Calic levelled the blaster and fired. The rebellious functionary swayed, slumped, and then crashed down to the crowd. They all drew back, terrified. A squad of uniformed functionaries, under the command of a military official, pushed their way to the body and dragged it off. The functionaries returned to their work. The little rebellion died away without trace, like the ripples from a stone thrown into a pond. Orem gave a satisfied nod. It pleased his sense of fitness to see order restored. Casually he asked, "You eradicated him?" Calic put his blast away. No, merely rendered him unconscious. Our medical colleagues have asked for such specimens to be taken alive. He will be disposed of? Orem wondered. Naturally, but first his mental and nervous system will be analysed. Our colleagues wish to discover if some disease or mutation is causing these outbreaks of rebellion. It did occur to Calic that it was not the rebellious functionaries who were abnormal, but the conditions under which they had to live and work. His conscience clear and untroubled, he put away his blaster. Now one must deal with these aliens. Terrified by this display of casual ruthlessness, Vorg and Sherna quailed, as the two officials bore down upon them, and we reach the end of Chapter 1. Thank you, Terrance Dicks, for only making it 15 pages. So, I'm teasing you now. There's Chapter 2, you're not getting it now. The bookmark's going in. I'm out and about today. I'll show you where. Down by the River Cam. And I'll try and find another bench in a few miles' time. And I'll have another sit down, because last time I did this bike ride, it did rather tire me out. So I've decided to build breaks into it. And to build book reading into those breaks. Hello, Bill. Yes, it's an excellent first chapter, Carl, isn't it? So, I'm going to say goodbye now, because I must get on with this bike ride, because it is several miles, and yeah, it's gorgeous down here. It's absolutely gorgeous. I'm going to take a few photos. So what I'm going to do is head on, trying to take photos as I go, and then I'll try and find another place to stop, and we'll read chapter 2. So bye for now. Hello. Now I think about 4 miles outside Cambridge, still by the River Cam. Just over there is Batespite Lock. I'm also somewhere somewhat noisy, because just round that bend in the river is where the A14 crosses the road, crosses the river. Now, unfortunately, the A14 is the busiest road in this part of... oh, hello Christian, hello Stu, hello Bill. Wave. And yeah, it's a bit noisy around here, but I found a shady nook, so hopefully I won't get as much wind this time. Oh, this is going to be fun. One-handedly, I'm going to take a bookmark out. Hello, Nikki. Just down by the river. I'm guessing you're at work having tea break. Hang on. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong thing here. Oh. Now, we're on to chapter 2 of the book. You get to hear my dulcet tones again. Hello. Reading glasses on. Chapter 2. Oh, it's such a juggle. Hang on, now where are we? The monster from the sea. Peering through the partly open hatch, the doctor looked at the peaceful maritime scene around him. Everything suggested that Joe was perfectly right. They were on a small cargo vessel, Probably in tropical waters, and yet appearances can be deceptive, Joe, he warned. I still feel there's something very wrong here. The small figure on the ladder below gave an impatient snort. Something wrong with the way you steer the TARDIS, more like. We are still on Earth, aren't we? The doctor shook his head decisively. No, that's impossible. We don't seem to be on Metabelius 3, but we're not on Earth either. Never admit you're wrong, do you? Hissed Joe. The doctor grinned. That's impossible, too. The sail is gone now. Let's take a look around. Blinking in the hot sunlight, they climbed out of the hatch, lowered it quietly behind them. They moved across the deck of the little ship of the superstructure and stepped through a doorway. Now they were in a short metal-walled passage. From an open door at the other end they heard voices. "Splendid dinner this," someone was saying in a fruity English tones. "Absolutely topping." Joe and the doctor crept along the passage and peeped through the half-open door. They saw a small, well-furnished saloon. 3 people were sitting around a table over the remains of a meal. An attractive young girl was pouring herself a cup of coffee, and a rosy-haired man in a rather rumpled tropical suit was pouring himself a large whiskey from a decanter. A handsome young man in the uniform of a ship's officer was listening politely to the older man, but giving his real attention to the girl. The older man, whose name was Major Daly, took an appreciative sip of his whiskey. "You say the cook's a Madrassi, Andrews?" "I believe so, sir." Lieutenant Andrews somewhat managed to give him a polite reply to this question without taking his eyes from the girl. Claire Daly, the Major's daughter, smiled, well aware of the young officer's interest. Daly nodded thoughtfully. "Find the Madrassi boys a bit idle myself. Won't have one on the plantation. Still, I must say your fellow knows how to cook a curry chicken." Daly nodded towards the decanter. "Sundowner, old chap?" Andrews shook his head. He glanced appealingly at Claire Daly, who smiled and took mercy on him. Finishing her coffee, she said demurely, "Lieutenant Andrews and I thought we'd take a turn around the deck. Care to join us, Daddy? It's a glorious evening." Claire knew she was on safe ground. It was highly unlikely that her father would forsake his armchair and his book, to say nothing of the whiskey decanter. Sure enough, Daly grunted and shook his head. "Oh no, you and young Andrews don't need me. You run along. I'm on board a spot of reading." Determined to finish his book before we reach Bombay, Claire laughed. We're due tomorrow. We're due tomorrow, remember. How much have you got left?" "Oh, only another 2 chapters. Andrews stood up. "We'll see you later then, sir." "Come along, Claire. 20 times round the deck is a mile." Doctor and Joe saw him usher the girl through a second door at the far end of the saloon. They watched Major Daly settle himself into a comfortable armchair. His book on his lap, he read only a page or 2 before his head started nodding. The book slipped from his lap, and he began to snore. The doctor gave Joe a nod, and they slipped into the saloon. They crept up on Daly, who slept on happily. Then they heard approaching voices. Andrews and Claire were walking along the deck just outside the window. "I love musical comedies," Claire was saying. "I saw Lady Be Good 4 times, and wasn't that young American fellow marvellous? Fred something or other." Her voice died away. Joe and the doctor stood up. Now the only sound breaking the silence was that of Daly's contented snores. The doctor looked round the little salon, shaking his head unbelievingly in spite of everything. "Joe, I still say this isn't Earth." "All right, Doctor, I'll convince you." Joe picked up Daly's book, turned to the title page. "Look, date of publication 1926. The doctor took the book, looked at it, and shook his head. "I know, Joe, every little detail, but—" Joe was hopping up and down with frustration. "You're so stubborn, Doctor. You ought to have an L plate on that police box." The doctor said quietly. Come on, Joe. We're going back to the TARDIS. Don't know what's happening here, but I don't like it. He moved towards the door, but stopped when Joe didn't follow. What's the matter? Don't you want to stay here? I just want you to admit the truth, Doctor. Instead of swanning around in some distant galaxy, we've slipped back 50 years in time. Come on a little cargo boat in the ocean, and... Joe's tirade was cut short by a shattering roar from the outside the cabin. They heard a scream from Claire, a sudden shout from Andrews. Daly started to mutter and stir, and the doctor pulled Joe quickly into the corridor, just as Claire, Lieutenant Andrews, came back, running back. Daly stumbled to his feet. What's going on? Andrews led Claire across to her father. Some kind of sea monster, sir. It's hideous. There was another roar, and a jolting crash shook the ship as something huge slammed against it. The doctor led Joe to a porthole, and they looked around. An enormous sea creature was swimming around the boat, its savage head waving on about the end of a fantastically long neck. The monster roared once again, then plunged back into the sea. They saw it swimming away for a while, and it disappeared beneath the waves. What was that thing? Joe gasped. A plesiosaurus, said the doctor, and if this is 1926, the plesiosaurus has been extinct for millions of years. In the salon, Daly was staring fascinatingly out of the porthole. I say, it's gone back into the sea. I'll get a rifle, said Andrews, just in case it decides to come back. Look after Claire, will you, sir? Of course, my boy. Come along, my dear. Major led shivering Claire to the comfortable chair and settled her down. He looked almost yearningly out of the porthole. By Jove, what a monstrous beast! Claire buried her face in her hands. It was awful, horrible, she sobbed. There, child, said her father soothingly. We'll take a shot at it. And if it does come back, what a head! Love to have that on the club wall, he said. He went on, staring out the porthole. Joe and the doctor were now on the far side of the saloon door. They had to pass it to get to their cargo hatch. They tiptoed past it very quietly. Unfortunately, Claire Daly happened to look up exactly as they were framed in the doorway. She stared at them in amazement and then let out a little cry. Daly turned, came back to the door. Oh, hello, he said wonderingly. Hello, said the doctor cheerily. Topping day, what? I say a minute, old chap. Are you two passengers? Only temporary. Doctor made an attempt to get away, but now Daly had come back into the corridor and was blocking their exit. He stared at them. Temporarily? Joe decided to take a hand. Uncle means just until we reach Bombay, she said brightly. Claire had come over to join her father. I thought we were the only passengers. Where did you come on board? Port side, said Joe hurriedly, hoping their geography was accurate. Claire looked puzzled. I still don't understand why we haven't met before. Joe felt she was getting in deeper and deeper. And the doctor wasn't any help. He just smiled blandly and let her flounder on. Well, my uncle here hasn't been well, she said, getting a bit of her own back. We've mostly stayed below. Daly looked at the doctor sympathetically. Poor traveller, eh? Not used to it, I suppose. The doctor rose to this immediately. On the contrary, sir, I happen to be very experienced. Andrews came in, rifle in his hand. He stopped at the sight of the little group, then crossed to the salon with them. Who are these people? Daly stared at them. Don't you know, Andrews? They got on at port side. Andrews shook his head. Stowaways, eh? Where have you been hiding yourselves? Joe drew a deep breath and then gave up. She looked at the doctor. You tell them, Uncle. To Vorg and Schörner's surprise, the two Minorian officials didn't approach them at once. They stopped a little way off and stood quietly, talking, glancing occasionally at the two Lermans. Meanwhile, a crowd of functionaries was gathering around the alcove, staring curiously at the two aliens and their strange machine. Vorg, busily checking over the machine, didn't notice them at first. Schöner jabbed at him in the ribs. "Hey, Vorg!" He looked up and she indicated the crowd of curious faces. Vorg smiled. Crowds were his business. Well, we seem to be getting an audience. We'd better start the pitch. What, here? Oh, why not? Real showman can work anywhere. Vorg raised his voice to a practiced and carrying chant. Roll up, me lucky lads. And the functionaries crowded closer. Hang on a minute, said Sherma. Hurriedly she brushed down her costume and struck a dramatic pose, gesturing towards the scope. Vorg went into his patter. Roll up, see the real-life monster show. A whole carnival of monsters, live and crawling in this amazing device. See them living, wild in their natural habitat. A miracle of intergalactic technology. Roll up. The two Minorian officials watched these goings-on from safe distance. So those two strange beings are Lerman, said Calic distastefully. Orm consulted a document. It appears that one of them is a male called Vorg and the female is Schöner. Ridiculous, these alien names. One is relieved that their physical form is familiar. One feared they might have 4 heads, although it is still unpleasant to have to fraternize with any alien race. Despite the fact that he was the President's Commissioner, Calic was one of the old school. Nevertheless, Commissioner Calic, one has duty to perform, Orm said solemnly. One will wait for Commissioner Pletrak. He is the chairman of our little tribunal. Let him perform his duty. Meanwhile, one will observe these aliens a little longer. Vorg wasn't enjoying his usual success with his showman's patter. In fact, it seemed rather to alarm the functionaries. Slowly they began drifting away from the alcove. Schöner, who had been watching his efforts with cynical resignations, glanced towards the scope. A light was flickering on the control panel. She attracted Vorg's attention with her usual jab in the ribs. Vorg abandoned his patter and went over to the scope. Oh, it's nothing, he said uneasily. He thumped the side of the scope with his fist. The light still flickered. I'm sure it's nothing. That light indicates a systems defect, doesn't it? No, it's just another loose connection, nothing of consequence. A systems defect, said Schöner firmly. Vorg gave the scope an angry kick. Of all the times to go wrong. He shook off his coat, rolled up his sleeves. I'll have to take off the inspection plate and get the tools, will you, Schöner? And I'm probably running low on battery. Not very friendly. Vorg grunted. They're officials. Officials are never friendly. Hopefully we can finish this and I'll get the phone on charge. A third Minorian official had arrived to join the other two. He too was grey-robed and grey-faced, but his white hair and stooped shoulders gave him an air to his years. He bustled up to Calic and Orm. One hears that yet another functionary has gone berserk, he said in shocked tones. One witnessed the event, said Calic coldly. In fact, one dealt with it. Orm shook his head sadly. One cannot understand why they do it. But then, one is not a functionary, said Calic, in a bored tone. Pletrak looked sharply at him. It is a growing problem. As members of the official state, we must all share President Zarb's concern. Functionaries have no sense of responsibility, said Orm sadly. Give them a hygiene chamber, and only store their issue of fossil fuel in it. In his alcove, Vorg had finally managed to get the inspection panel off the scope. Pass the miniscope scanner, he ordered Schöner, fished a telescope-like device from the bag and handed it to him. Vorg peered through it, jiggled it about, and then gave a sudden grunt of satisfaction. Schöner leaned over his shoulder. Have you located the fault? There's a bit of foreign matter inside of Circuit 3. Can you get it out? I think so. It's really only a matter of unscrewing a circuit base plate. I'll have a look in the microdriver, will you? As Schöner searched in the untidy jumble of tool bag, Vorg peered again through the microscanner. It's a funny thing, he said thoughtfully. This foreign body seems to be some kind of blue box. And there endeth chapter 2. And my phone is down to about 10%, so I'm going to end this rapidly, get the phone on charge, and hopefully it'll have a bit more juice and we can do chapter 3 before I cycle home. Bye for now. So, back home, no longer fighting the weather while I read, but fighting the heat from the sun. Hence these somewhat large pores since I last tried one of these, but onwards. We try and work out a way of holding a book and holding a phone. Hello, Stu. Oh, let's just hit that. Oh. The doctor's attempts at explaining their presence on board had met with little success. Reluctant as always to disclose the existence of the TARDIS, he had spun a long and complicated story about having to leave portside because of some urgent secret mission which he wasn't free to disclose. The doctor thought it quite a good story, but unfortunately Lieutenant Andrews didn't believe a word of it. "I suppose you realise the captain could have you put in irons," he said grimly. "My dear fellow, do you think that's necessary?" "Not if you start telling the truth." Claire Daly was beginning to feel sorry for the two newcomers. "Oh, do stop bullying them, John," she said. "That's right, stop bullying us," said Joe, grateful for the unexpected ally. Major Daly, too, seemed to think things were going a bit too far. "I say, why don't we all have a drink and talk this all over like civilized people?" "An excellent idea," the doctor promptly said. "I have a small—" "Major Daly," cut in Andrews firmly, "these people are certainly stowaways and quite possibly criminals." "Oh, dash it all," protested Daly, "the fellow is a shalib." Ooh, whatever shalib means. "Hello, Alan." "Nevertheless, this is not a social occasion. Still, don't see why we shouldn't offer basic hospitality." Andrews smiled grimly. "I'd like to offer them the hospitality of your cabin, sir. There's a good strong lock on the door. There they can wait till the captain is free to see them." "Oh, very well," said Daly. "Put them in my cabin by all means." Andrews gestured sharply with his rifle. "Right, you two, this way." As he marched them off down the corridor, the doctor said, "You see, we should have left where I wanted to." "Well, you got to see it in the first place," hissed Joe. Andrews marched them along to a cabin door and opened it. Just outside the door was an octagonal metal plate set into the floor. The doctor looked at Andrews. "Are there many of these on the ship?" "Many of what?" "These things," the doctor said, pointing. "Are there others? Is this the only one?" Andrews stared at him. There's nothing there." Joe looked down at the plate and then up at Andrews. "You mean you can't see it?" Andrews raised the rifle. "Get in that cabin," he ordered sharply. They went in. Major Daly's cabin was small but comfortable, with usual brass and mahogany ship furnishings. Bunk, washstand, writing desk, armchair, clothes locker. Everything seemed utterly normal. Andrews stood in the doorway. "Don't know what you two are up to, but I've got a crew of lascars who try—" let me just get the page turn. "Try to make a fool of me on every trip. They haven't succeeded yet, and neither will you two." Joe gave a cheeky grin. "Don't underestimate us." The doctor was studying a framed plan of the ship on the cabin wall. He read the lettering underneath. "I say, old chap, is this the SS Bernese?" "Are you trying to pretend you don't even know that?" "I didn't. Now I do, and that makes everything much clearer. Thank you." Andrews felt he was being made fun of, and he didn't care for it. "All right, I'm going to lock you in here until the captain's ready to see you. He's a very busy man, so that might take a long time. Andrews left, slamming the door hard behind him. They heard the key turn in the lock and his footsteps going away. Joe turned to the doctor. "All right, you said everything was much clearer. Explain." "Well, relatively speaking, an octagonal plate in the floor and a prehistoric monster in the sea. Yes, it's really most interesting." The doctor stretched out comfortably on the bunk. Joe sank into a chair. "Do you really think Andrews couldn't see that metal plate?" "I'm sure he couldn't, Joe. It was blocked from his consciousness, you see. It isn't really part of the fabric of the ship." "Not part of the ship? A great lump of—" The doctor smiled infuriatingly. "Exactly. A lump of what? Not steel, iron, copper, aluminium. That metal isn't known on Earth." Joe waved a hand round the little cabin. "We must be on Earth. This cabin, this ship, the chickens, the people. You're not going to tell me Major Daly's an alien from another planet." The doctor pointed to a calendar beside the bunk. "Look at this. Daly's been keeping track of the date." Joe saw the calendar. It was for the year 1926. It was open at the month of June, and someone had crossed off the days as far as June the 4th. The doctor nodded to the wall plan. "And what about the name of the ship? Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "No? Should it?" "Well, for a time the SS Bernice was the centre of a mystery as famous as the Mary Celeste." "What happened?" "Nobody ever knew," said the doctor mysteriously. "A freak wave was the favourite explanation, but the Indian Ocean was calm as a millpond that night." "You mean the ship sank?" "She vanished, Joe. 2 days from Bombay, on the night of June the 4th, the Bernice disappeared from the face of the earth, or rather the sea." Joe looked at the calendar. "June the 4th. But that's today." "Intriguing, isn't it?" said the doctor cheerfully. Joe was looking at the cabin clock. "Shall I tell you something else intriguing? When we came in here, that clock said 25 to 8. Now look at it." The doctor looked. The clock's hands were at 20 to 6. "So you've noticed that?" "Well, I've noticed something else. It's still broad daylight outside." "So? Well, if it's really after dinner, and we really are in..." Hang on a minute. Let's change that page. "The Indian Ocean, it should be pitch dark by now." The doctor swung his long legs from the bunk and made for the door, rattling the handle experimentally. "Sonic screwdriver?" suggested Joe. The doctor looked a little sheepish. "I'm afraid that only works on electronic locks, Joe. This is a simpler lock, and we need a simpler tool." Joe produced a bunch of skeleton keys. "Like this?" The doctor stared at her. "Why on earth are you carrying those things around with you? If I've learned one thing in travelling about with you, Doctor, it's that sooner or later we're bound to get locked up. Allow me." Watched by the astonished doctor, Joe started to pick the lock. It didn't take her long to get it open. They went out into the corridor, and Joe thought they'd make straight for the TARDIS. But the doctor knelt by the metal plate in the floor and started to examine it. "Works by some kind of anti-magnetic cohesion," he muttered. "Can you open it?" "Not without a magnetic core extractor." "That's that then," said Joe, relieved. "Let's get back to the TARDIS." Their positions had become reversed. Joe was anxious to get away, while the doctor wanted to stay and investigate further. "As a matter of fact," said Joe slowly, "I do happen to have a magnetic core extractor somewhere in the TARDIS." "Oh," said the doctor slowly. Joe sighed. "Of course, I might have known you wouldn't travel without one." The problem about getting back to the TARDIS was that it was involved going past the passenger saloon. They crept towards it. As they approached the As they approached the open door, they heard voices. "Splendid dinner, this," someone was saying in a fruity English tone. "Absolutely topping. You say the cook's a Madrassi, Andrews?" They heard Andrews' polite reply. "I believe so, sir. I find the Madrassi boys a bit idle myself. Won't have one on the plantation. Still, I must say your fellow knows how to cook curry a chicken." "Sundowner, old chap?" Then came Claire's voice. "Lieutenant Andrews and I thought we'd take a turn round the deck. Care to join us? It's a glorious evening." "No, you young Andrews don't need me. Run along, I'm going to do a spot of reading, determined to finish this book before we reach Bombay." Astonished, Joe heard the whole sequence of events replay itself exactly as before. They heard the clink of the decanter as Daly settled himself in the armchair. Claire and Andrews went out on the deck, talking just as before. Joe pulled the doctor's sleeve. "Come on, doctor, let's get out of here." The doctor didn't move. "Hang on a moment, Joe. I've got a theory about what's happening here, and we should get confirmation any minute." "Nothing's happening here. That's what's so creepy. They're going round and round like a stuck gramophone record." "That's right. They've been programmed to repeat a simple behaviour pattern." "That monster, the Plesiosaurus, that's been programmed too?" "I imagine so." Next page. "But there weren't any plesiosaurs in 1926. "Exactly. I'm afraid that, historically speaking, this collection is a bit of a jumble. You trying to tell me that this ship and everyone on it are all part of some kind of collection? Everything round here seems so ordinary. Joe, have you ever seen a child at the seaside filling a bucket with sea creatures? After a while they behave quite normally. Only the boy looking down at them knows their environment has changed. Human beings are rather more intelligent than whelks. And these specimens were collected by more sophisticated methods than a net and pail. But the principle's the same." "I'm sorry, Doctor, I just don't believe it." There came a shattering roar from outside the ship. They heard a scream from Claire, a sudden shout from Andrews. Daly stumbled to his feet. "What's going on?" The doctor pulled Joe back around a corner as Andrews and Claire rushed past them. They heard this voice from the salon. "Some kind of sea monster, sir. It's hideous." There was another roar and a jolting crash as something enormous slammed against the ship. The doctor led Joe to the porthole, and they saw the many-fangled head on the incredibly long neck of the Plesiosaurus swam round the boat. They ducked quickly back into hiding as Andrew's voice came from the salon. "I'll get a rifle just in case it decides to come back." "Again, look after Claire, will you, sir?" Andrews rushed out of the salon, disappeared on deck. Now, said the doctor, "quick, before she looks up." With Claire's head still buried in her hands and Daly staring out the window, they ran past the open door. As they passed it, Daly's voice floated out. "What a head, eh? Love to have that on the club wall." Keeping low, the doctor and Joe scurried along the deck. In the bows, Andrews, rifle in hand, a few terrified lascars behind him, was staring after the Plesiosaurus as it sank roaring back into the sea. The doctor lifted the cargo hatch, and they both descended into the hot darkness that smelled of chickens. The familiar shape of the TARDIS stood in the corner, and they made their way through the gloom towards it. Joe hoped they'd be able to go inside and take off, but she should have known better. "Hang on there a moment," said the doctor, reaching for his key. "I'll pop inside and get the magnetic core extractor." "Can't we just go home, Doctor?" The doctor's voice came through the open door of the TARDIS. "Where's your scientific curiosity, Joe? Don't you want to know what's going on?" "No, not much." The doctor came out of the TARDIS, an oddly shaped gadget in hand, and locked the door behind him. Just a quick look at what's behind that metal plate, and we'll be off, I promise. There came a sudden, terrified scream from Joe, and... well, what a point to end the page. And... the doctor swung around. Joe pointed upwards, too frightened to speak. A section of the cargo hold high above them had just opened out, as if someone on some kind of hinge. Through the gap, an enormous hand appeared, the hand of a giant. It groped around vaguely for a moment, and then started descending towards them. Well, I'm going to leave it there for a sec, because I want to put my podcast together, and hopefully there'll be time after that for Chapter 4, so bye for now. Well, I've just put my podcast together, so let's get back to the book, shall we? Chapter 4. Joe and the doctor cowered away, crouched behind a pile of crates as the giant hand seemed to reach for them. It came lower and lower, and then, with a slight change of direction, its index finger and thumb closed on the TARDIS. It lifted the police box as a man might pick up a box of matches from a drawer. Holding the TARDIS, the giant hand disappeared through the gap. "Hey, that's mine. Bring it back." His only answer was an echoing clang as the section of hold swung back and the darkness returned. Joe's face popped up from behind a crate. "Doctor, that hand, has it gone?" "It has, and it's taken the TARDIS with it." Joe stared upwards, but there was no way through. "Are you sure?" Part of the hold swung open. Joe looked up at the steel wall. "That must weigh tons and tons." "You saw the size of that hand." "We've been up there," persisted Joe. "There's only the deck. There must be an optical illusion as well as a temporal one. I told you this was no ordinary ship. And now we're trapped on it with the TARDIS gone." Let's turn the damn page, which is a fiddly thing to do. "Don't worry," said the doctor reassuringly. "It's only a matter of finding where it's gone and getting it back." Joe was almost speechless. "Only? Where do we start?" "Well, we start by finding a way off this ship." The doctor started towards the ladder, wondering just how they were going to get off the ship in the middle of the ocean. Joe followed him. Vorg withdrew his hand from the scope with a satisfying grunt. "Got it!" Shona leaned over his shoulder. "Let's have a look." Vorg kept his hand inside the scope's inspection note. "Got to keep it within the miniaturization field. Here it is." Shona looked at the little blue box. "That was causing all the trouble." "Apparently. Must be electrically charged in some way." "How did it get in there?" "Search me. Maybe it was there all along and just got displaced. Anyway, I'll put it here on the spare parts shelf." Vork straightened up and started to replace the hatch. "Just in time," whispered Shona. "Our grey friends are coming over at last." Their long deliberations finished, the three Minorian officials were striding towards them, Pletrak in the lead, as befitted his rank, Kalik and Aurum flanking him. The Minorians paused at a safe distance, unwilling to risk alien contamination. "One must now collect their data strips, Pletrak." Aurum stepped back, shuddering. "Physical contact?" he asked in a horrified tone. "You are the chairman," said Kalik in his waspish tone. "One suggests you approach them, Pletrak." The old man settled his robes on his shoulder. One has no fears, he said rather nervously. Your Lerman is a simple fellow, good-natured and trusting. He responds well to firm leadership and is capable of great loyalty. Perhaps we should import them to replace our functionaries, sneered Calec. Pletrak strode up to Vorg and Schöner. We, friends, he said in a rather quavering voice. Vorg produced his lowest bow. Your worship, Schöner curtsied prettily. There was an embarrassed pause. You give magic talk boxes. I'm going to have to reread that line. You give magic talk boxes, says Pletrak. Vorg and Schöner stared at each other. Vorg whispered, I think he wants the data strips. Schöner fished out the 2 plastic microstrips, held them out to Pletrak. It's all right, she said encouragingly. We don't bite. The old man snatched the strips and scuttered back to his fellows. There were more deliberations. Schöner shook her head. They're a weird lot. I don't know why you were so keen to come here, Vorg. Vorg leaned forward confidentially. This planet cut itself off from the rest of the galaxy after the Great Space Plague. They've only just opened their frontiers again. Traders are coming in, but we're the first entertainers. No one else saw the opportunity. Let's turn the page again. You mean none of them have seen anything like the scope before? Exactly. Think of it, Schöner. The great audience out there, the whole world of them. We'll go back to Lerma with 1 million credit bars. Pletrak and his tribunal were studying the data strips on a portable computer terminal. Pletrak looked up. There seemed to be an order. Record is incomplete, objected Calec. There's no reference to the machine. Machines are harmless, said Pletrak curiously. We've examined the data strips and found them in good order. What should we do? Examine the machine, snapped Calec, and shot a glance at Aurum. One agrees, Aurum said hurriedly. It would be advisable. Pletrak moved over to Vorg and Schöner. Calec and Aurum followed him. Pletrak handed back the data strips. These are in order, but the tribunal requests to know more about the purpose of your machine. Vorg was shocked. His moustache and eyebrows seemed to bristle with outrage. Machine, your worships? The scope is no mere machine. Calec was unimpressed. What is it, then? Vorg cleared his throat impressively. The scope is a unique artistic achievement, the supreme creative invention of our age. It is my proud privilege to bring its many wonders to your noble planet. You will be amazed. You will be astounded. Calec's dry voice cut across the flow of Vorg's oratory. Is it a machine within the normal meaning of the world? Vorg heaved a dramatic sigh. Machine is such a paltry description, your worship. Cease prevaricating, snapped Calec. What is the machine's function? What does it do? Vorg sighed. Some people have no poetry in their souls. Well, your worships, he began, it's like this. Since the octagonal metal plate was just out... it's like this. Since the octagonal metal plate was just outside Major Daly's cabin, the Doctor and Joe followed the same route as before. They were working their way along the deck towards the passenger saloon, slipping from cover to cover, when they heard voices coming towards them. They had just time to duck behind a lifeboat as Lieutenant Andrews and Claire came along the deck, still discussing musical comedies. I absolutely adored Chu Chin Chow, Claire was saying. Daddy took me when I was a little girl. Andrews laughed. I tell you, the whole thing is absolute rubbish. I've sailed into Shanghai 50 times, my girl, and I know what Johnny Chinaman really like. They passed on their way, chattering happily. Joe whispered, I suppose we're due for the monster bit any time soon now. Very probably, said the Doctor. Sure enough, there came the shattering roar, and a savage head on a long wavering neck appeared out of the sea. Let's not see it round again, said Joe. When you've seen one plesiosaurus, you've seen 'em all. They were the same roars from the monster, the same shouts of alarm from Andrews and Claire. Andrews hurried Claire back to her father and ran. Oh, page turn. Anne ran off to the arms locker. "Come on," said the doctor. "Now's our chance." They ran through the door, along the passage, and tiptoed towards the open door of the passenger saloon. As they reached it, Claire was in her chair, face in hands. Daly was gazing out of the porthole. "What a head, hey? Love to have that on the club wall." But this time he turned a fraction earlier and caught sight of Joe and the doctor creeping past. Obviously it was possible for minor variations to occur within the programmed pattern of events. Major Daly gaped at them. "Ho!" he said. "Topping day, what?" said the doctor. "Absolutely splendid," replied Daly politely. The doctor struggled to remember his early 20th century slang. "Well, 23 skidoo must get on, eh? Pip pip." Daly came to the saloon door. "I say, are you passengers?" "Don't you remember?" said Joe. "You asked us that before." Daly looked at her in disbelief. "How could I? I've never bally seen you in before in my life." The three Minorian officers listened to Vorg's explanations in sceptical silence. Pletrak attempted a summing up. "If I understand you so far, it appears that you travel from planet to planet with this machine, performing some kind of ritual? For what purpose?" Shona decided to take a hand. "We're entertainers," she explained patiently. "Entertainers?" Pletrak was none the wiser. "Explain the term." "We put on a show," said Shona. "You understand?" She did a little tap dance by way of demonstration. The three Minorians recoiled in alarm. "No," said Pletrak. "Our purpose is to amuse," confirmed Vorg. "Nothing serious, nothing political. Amusement is prohibited. It is purposeless." Pletrak led his two colleagues to one side. "President Zarb has lifted that restriction. His thinking is that lack of amusement is causing these outbreaks of rebellion amongst the functionaries." "More anti-productive legislation," hissed Calic. Oram shook his head mournfully. "One wonders where it will end." "One can see where it will end, Oram. The functionaries will take over." Calic spoke dryly. Pletrak looked sharply at him. "It is not the functionaries who dream of power, Calic. Since President Zarb is your brother, one hoped for more loyalty." "One simply speaks one's thoughts," said Calic smoothly. The old man glared at him. "Your thoughts are plain as your ambitions." "How dare you?" Oram tried to smooth over the quarrel. "Pletrak, Calic, please, we are here simply to decide whether to grant these entertainers an entrance visa." Calic spoke first. "In the view of their subversive purpose and their dubious machine, one moves that the application be rejected." Turn the page again. "Motion opposed," said Pletrak. Calic looked at Oram, who said hurriedly, "Motion supported." Pletrak sighed. "Very well." He led the little group back to Vorg and Shona. "I regret to tell you that your application for a visa has been rejected by the tribunal. You will be allotted a space on the next outbound cargo thruster." Vorg was shattered at the sudden disillusion of his dreams of wealth. "But, your worship," he stammered. "Please, I beg of you. We spent the last of our credit bars on our journey here." Calic gave him an indifferent look. "That was unwise," he said, turning away. Vorg made a final effort. "If your worships would permit me to demonstrate the wonders of the scope, I'm sure you would be ready to reconsider the scope. Is not only amusing, but it's educational too." Pletrak was old-fashioned and conservative, but he was also fair-minded. He hadn't cared for the way in which Calic had forced the tribunal's decision. "The suggestion is reasonable," he said firmly. "Demonstrate." Borg bustled around, overjoyed. If your worships would take up their positions at the viewing apertures. This way, your worships. He arranged the 3 Minorian officials at viewing apertures around the scope and moved to the controls. Now, if you will gaze deeply into the glow sphere. The viewing apparatus of the scope produced a mild hypnotic effect, while making the viewer feel part of the scene he was witnessing. Immediately, the 3 Minorians seemed to be left the familiar bustle of the spaceport and to be standing on some bleak alien planet. Towards them lumbered a huge ape-like creature dressed in rough leather clothing. Pletrak jumped back in alarm and was relieved to find himself still at the spaceport. What was that thing? A primitive life form called an Ogron, said Vorg. I believe they are used as servants by some race called Daleks. If your worship will return to the viewing place. Vorg twiddled the controls. The Minorians were transported to a streaming tropical swamp. With a bit of luck, said Vorg, I will be able to show you the pride of my collection, the Drashings. Far away in the swamp there was a roar and a splash, then nothing more. Amazing, said Kallik ironically. Borg was apologetic. The Drashings have no intelligence centres, unfortunately, so it's impossible to control them. I'll switch over to the Terrans. Less spectacular, but extremely controllable. One of their planet's native sea monsters has been added to their habitat for increased variety. Should see them react when it appears. This time the Minorians found themselves in a kind of living chamber in which a number of Terrans were talking agitatedly. The species was discovered in a distant galaxy, said Vorg, in his best lecturer's voice. You will note the strong resemblance these little chaps bear to our own life form. Kallik shuddered. The resemblance is unpleasant. Are they going to do anything? Turn the page again. We're almost at the end of the chapter. Vorg felt his show was failing to impress, and he decided to give it a boost. Observe closely, your worship. By simple adjustment of the agrometer, so these peaceful Terrans can be made to behave in an amusingly aggressive manner. In the passenger saloon of the SS Bernice, the programmed sequence of events was playing itself out. Once again, the Doctor and Joe had become part of it. Just as before they had tried to elude Daly and Claire, just as before Andrews had turned up, this time with a couple of armed seamen, and disbelieved their explanations. It looked as if they were to be locked up in Daly's cabin all over again. A low humming note rang throughout the ship. No one except Joe and the Doctor seemed to notice it, but suddenly the atmosphere became hostile and threatening. His eyes blazing with anger, Andrews shouted, "So, you persist in sticking to this ridiculous story, do you?" The Doctor said sharply, "And what if I do, sir?" Andrews tossed his rifle to a soldier, stripped off his coat and started to roll up his sleeves. "Then I propose to thrash you to within an inch of your life." The 3 Minorians stared fascinatingly into the scope. "What ritual are they performing now?" asked the Aurum. Vorg looked into his viewing aperture. "2 of the males are about to engage in physical combat, your worship." Jo Grant felt she was living in some kind of nightmare. Lieutenant Andrews was rolling up his sleeves over the brawny arms, and the Doctor had taken off his coat and was rolling up the sleeves of his ruffled shirt. Jo looked at Andrews, so much younger and stronger than his opponent. "Doctor, you can't," she whispered. The Doctor seemed caught up in the prevailing madness. "I most certainly can," he said briskly. "It will give me the greatest of pleasure to teach this insolent young puppy a much-needed lesson." Tone and manner quite unlike his normal self. Jo turned to Major Daly and Claire. Surely they would make some protest. "Please," she pleaded. "You've got to stop them. It isn't fair." Neither father nor daughter seemed to hear her, and they were both leaning forward excitedly, eyes shining with bloodthirsty eagerness, waiting for the fight to begin. Preparations completed, the two opponents move towards each other. And that is the end of chapter 4. And I'm going to take a break now. It's almost time for me to eat. And hopefully I should be back with chapter 5. Well, it'll be tomorrow afternoon UK time. Hope you've been enjoying these. Hello, welcome to part 5. Part 6 will hopefully be in about 90 minutes because I'm just about to watch a film. Now, I'm getting this down to a fine art, taking the bookmark out with one hand while holding the phone with the other hand. So, chapter 5. Jo didn't know much about boxing, but she couldn't help noticing the differences in styles. Andrews moved forwards in a crouch, shoulders hunched, chin tucked in, fists weaving protectively in front of him. He spoke through gritted teeth. "I think I ought to warn you, I used to box for my school." The doctor's stance was straight-laced, upright, right hand protecting his chin, left arm stretched out at full length. He moved with brisk, skipping steps. "And I should warn you, I used to spar with John L. Sullivan." The fight was short and savage. The two men came together in a flurry of blows. Jo saw the doctor dodge and block Andrews' punches with careless ease. The doctor's long left arm shot out, and his first caught Andrews on the cheekbone, then again on the nose. Stung by the two painful blows, Andrews swung a wild uppercut at the doctor's chin. The doctor dodged it with ease, and sunk a savage right hook into the younger man's solar plexus. Air whooshed from Andrews' body. His face went grey, and he collapsed like a leaking balloon, slumping slowly to the ground. Jo saw the doctor's face change. He leaned over his fallen opponent, appalled at what he's done. I was about to help him to his feet. Jo looked round. Claire, Major Daly, and the two soldiers were all staring open-mouthed at the gasping Andrews. She grabbed the doctor's coat from a chair. "Hurry, doctor, this way." The doctor stared wildly at her. Jo grabbed him by the arm and dragged him out of the saloon. They started to run towards Daly's cabin, but another unarmed seaman appeared at the end of the passage. They turned and ran the opposite way, out on the deck of the ship. In the saloon, Andrews was struggling to his feet. He grabbed his rifle and turned to the seaman. "Get after them! Cover the aft companionway! Quick, man! Shoot on sight!" They all ran from the saloon. Major Daly and Claire followed after them. "Don't want to miss the fun, do we?" puffed Daly as he hurried along. Hidden behind a lifeboat, Jo watched the doctor get back into his coat. "Extraordinary," he was muttering to himself. "Remote control aggressive stimulation. Felt it myself till I realised what was happening. I shouldn't have hit that poor young fellow so hard." There was a shout of, "There they are!" The crack of a rifle, and a bullet whizzed close to them. "Never mind him, Doctor," said Jo. "You worry about us." They sprinted across the decks, ducking and weaving to dodge the bullets. In the chase that followed, it seemed to Jo they must have covered every inch of the ship. They were hunted across decks, up and down companionways, into another cargo hold, and out again. Always behind them was the sound of running feet and the voice of Andrews harrying his Lascar seamen, and the crack of rifle fire wherever they were. If you turn the page now. Wherever they were spotted. As they ran along a stretch of open deck, Jo gasped. "How many times round the deck is a mile?" "Too open here," called the doctor. "Let's try that door." They ran to the door. The doctor grabbed at the handle, but the door was locked from the inside. There was a rifle shot, and a bullet ricocheted off metal. Jo looked up. Andrews, rifle at his shoulder, was crouching on a companionway above them. The doctor grabbed Joe's wrist and dragged around the corner. They found another door. Luckily this one did open. Once through the door, the doctor swung it closed behind them and locked it, just as bullets smacked against the other side of the steel door. Back inside the ship, they ran quickly along the narrow metal passages. "Look," said Joe, "there's a dining saloon." "That's right. That's the entrance to Daly's cabin. And there's the metal plate." The doctor quickly knelt beside the plate, taking the core extractor from his pocket. "Does it work?" asked Joe. The doctor began moving the little device along the edges of the plate. "Simple. You hold it flat, move it along the edges of the plate like this." "On your feet." They looked up at the harsh command. Andrews, Daly, and a handful of Lascar seamen, all carrying rifles, were running along the passage. The doctor glanced round for a weapon. There was a flare pistol clipped to a wall rack, and instinctively he reached for it, but too late. Andrews' rifle jabbed at his ribs. Slowly the doctor straightened up. Andrews slid back the bolt on his rifle. "We've just about had enough of your nonsense," he said angrily. "The punishment for piracy on the high seas is death." There was a fanatical gleam in his eye, and he was quite beyond the reach of reason. "Firing party!" he shouted. The Lascar seamen shuffled themselves into a line, rifles raised to cover the doctor and Joe. "No!" shouted the doctor. "You can't!" "Ready! Aim!" A low throbbing note sounded through the ship. For a moment Andrews, Daly, and the others froze like statues. Then, lowering his rifles, Andrews turned to the Major. "I say, sir, I think I heard the dinner gong going." "Splendid. Hope there's something decent tonight. I'm feeling rather peckish." "Think you'll enjoy a curry, sir. Our cook's a Madrassi, you know. First-rate chap." Andrews turned to the sailors. "Well, don't hang about, chaps. Get back to your duties. Chop, chop." The sailors hurried away, and Andrews and Daly strolled off down the corridor, chatting amiably. Abandoned by their former pursuers, Joe and the doctor stared at each other unbelievingly. Vorg looked up from the controls of the scope. "I've turned the agronometer right down," he explained. "Can't keep it on for too long, or the specimens start damaging each other." Almost disappointingly, the Minorians looked up from the scope. They moved aside again and began whispered conference among them. Schörner sidled up to Vorg. "Hey, I was watching that." "Oh, hang on a sec." "Hello, fool." "That last bit, they were all running around. Those two chasing them. Have you seen them before?" "Really, Schörner, how do I know? They all look alike to me," muttered Vorg irritably. He was looking at the Minorians, wondering if there was any chance of them changing their minds. No doubt about it, they'd been pretty impressed by the scope. "Vorg, listen. Those two Terrans are new." He stared at her. "Nonsense. That's impossible. How could they get in there? It's a closed system." Schörner shrugged. "Search me, but if I tell you they're strangers." Vorg scratched his head. "Well, there's only one explanation. They're breeding." "Fully grown species," said Schörner impatiently. We're a fully grown species," said Schörner impatiently. Vorg sighed. "Expelled from the planet, now strangers in the scope. It just didn't seem to be his day." "Hello, Jeff." Hang on. Joe watched the doctor slide the core extractor along the edge of the plate. Why did they all go rushing off like that? Because the influence that was acting on them must have probably been turned off suddenly, produced a temporary memory blackout. Ah, got it. The metal plate slid back, revealing a black opening. Joe peered down. Seems to be the mouth of some kind of shaft. "Doctor, like a metal pipe." "Right," said the doctor. "Down you go, then." Joe slid into the dark opening. The doctor grabbed the flare pistol from the wall rack, stuffed it in his pocket, and then followed her. The panels slid shut over their heads. Joe found herself sliding down a long, smooth metal tube. Luckily, the pipe was tilted at an angle so the drop wasn't too steep, and she found she could slow her descent by bracing herself against the sides. Suddenly, the pipe ended, and Joe shot out into space. She fell only a few feet, landing with a bump on a metal floor. A few seconds later, the doctor landed beside her. They picked themselves up and looked around. Joe gasped in amazement. They were deep inside some enormous and incredibly complex machine. Stretching above and below on every side were coils, circuits, wires, thick as cables, moving wheels, pistons, cogs. Some of the machinery hummed and throbbed. Valves and circuits gave off an eerie flicker of glow. Joe felt like an ant that had wandered inside the back of a television set, very small, very vulnerable, and very much out of place. She looked up at the doctor. Hands on hips, head thrown back, he was gazing absorbingly around them. On his face was an expression of pure rapture. "Just look at that filter circuit, Joe," he said decidedly. "What a beautiful piece of work. Now then, this must be the return system. So that must be the power feed over there." The doctor crawled into a narrow space between the two circuits, and his muffled voice echoed, Yes, it is. Come on, look at this, Joe. Magnificent." Joe tugged hard on one of his projecting legs, and he came reluctantly out. "Doctor, where are we?" she demanded. "What is this thing?" "What is it, my dear Joe? It's a magnificent example of an early pulse mechanism based on the principle of... let's turn the page. Chaosium decay. Oh, this is absolutely vintage stuff." Such was his enthusiasm that he seemed to have completely forgotten all their problems. "I take it this isn't the ship's engine room?" "Of course it isn't. We're not even on the ship anymore." "So where's the TARDIS?" "No idea. Probably been taken outside the machine entirely. Grit in the works, you see. We'll find it." Then he was off again. "Just look at this capillary hydraulic pump. Have you ever seen anything like that?" Joe hadn't and didn't much want to. "Doctor, the only reason we came inside this clockwork maze was to find the TARDIS, so if the TARDIS is outside, let's start finding our way out." The doctor nodded reluctantly. "I suppose you're right, Joe. Well, we'd better begin by following this circuit." They set off along a narrow metal tunnel, festooned in many-coloured wires. After yet another mini-conference, the three Minorian officials approached Vorg and Schörner once more. Vorg gave Schörner a confident nudge. "I knew it. My little demonstration won them over. They're going to change their minds and let us stay." Pletrak was leading the way as usual. He cleared his throat and said, "One thing still puzzles me about the tribunal. How were you able to influence the actions of the specimens as you did? Surely all these pictures are recorded." Vorg sighed. Hadn't they understood anything? Patiently he explained. "On the contrary, your worship, the scope is good old-fashioned live entertainment. The picture on the viewing aperture of the glow screen is a projection of what's actually taking place." In horrified tones, Calic hissed, "Do you mean to say all those creatures are actually living in there?" Vorg nodded proudly. "That is so, your worship, all happy and content in their own miniaturized environments. The incorporation of a simple temporal loop ensures that they repeat the same basic patterns hour after hour." Calic wasn't listening. He'd rounded on Pletrak in savage satisfaction. "You see where these new policies lead, Pletrak? This machine, this scope, contains actual live alien creatures. The Lerman has imported them without a license." Pletrak flushed with rage as he turned to Vorg. "Well, is this true?" "Is it?" Vorg was taken aback by the violence of the old man's reaction. Although he knew the Minorians' history, he hadn't realized the full extent of their hatred and fear of other life forms. He made his deepest bow. "Your worship, have I done anything to offend?" Calic was whispering fiercely to Pletrak. "Our laws expressly forbid the mass transportation of unscrutinized alien life forms to this planet. Even my well-meaning brother Zarb has not yet repealed that law. The creatures will have to be destroyed," said Aurum. Vorg caught the wind. "Destroyed, my specimens?" Pletrak nodded agitatedly. "Destroyed, and immediately." "You can't do that," pleaded Schörner. "Our livelihood." Let's get next page. "Depends on the scope. We're just simple strolling players, your worship. Pletrak ignored them. He drew back on the sleeves of his robe to reveal a wrist communicator. Send an Eradicator detachment to loading bay 2 immediately. He turned back to Vorg and spoke more gently. I am sorry, but the species and the machine must be destroyed at once. The regulations are quite clear. He turned away as if fearing contamination. The 3 officials waited at a discreet distance. Vorg glared at them. Bloodthirsty barbarians. He sat down tiredly beside the scope. Sherna joined him. Dim-witted yokels, you said they were. Twist them round your little finger. Have them eaten out of your hand. Fine mess we're in now, aren't we? Vorg raised his head indignantly. You're not blaming me, are you? Yes, I am, said Sherna flatly. I should have stayed with the all-star dance troupe. Third-rate bunch of hoofers, grunted Vorg scornfully. At least I always had a few credit bars to my name, and we never travelled by cargo thruster. The wrangle was interrupted by the sound of marching feet. A squad of uniformed functionaries pushing an enormous electronic cannon were forcing their way in through the crowd. Eradicator detachment, this way! Shouted Pletrak. The impressive, deadly-looking device was wheeled over, and its muzzle trained on the scope. Always the showman, Vorg jumped to his feet. Stood between the Eradicator and the scope, arms spread wide. Stand aside, ordered Pletrak. This is murder, shouted Vorg. Assassination! Massacre! I am not without influence, you know. There will be complaints. Pletrak coughed. Commence eradication, he said quietly. Vorg leaped clear. A uniformed functionary bent over the Eradicator controls. There was a hum of power, and metal parts of the scope began glowing red. The Doctor and Joe were nearing the end of their metal tunnel when it began to vibrate. Smoke filled the air, and it became appallingly hot. Joe staggered against a wall and jumped back. The metal was hot too. Doctor, she gasped, what's happening? Overcome by the heat, she slid to the floor. Vorg looked on glumly as the scope took the full blast of the Eradicator's power. There goes our living. Sherna was almost crying. More than our living, what about the specimens? Don't you realise they're all being killed while we watch? Oh. And this is the rather sudden ending of Chapter 5. Should be back, oh, hello Cass. I should be back with Chapter 6 in about an hour and a half, so goodbye for now. Hello and welcome to part 6. I'm getting through chapters at approximately 15 minutes ago, so I've got time for 2 chapters this time. So we'll start with chapter 6 and then we'll go on to chapter 7. Chapter 6, The Monster in the Swamp. In theory, the scope should have disintegrated completely under the beam of the Eradicator, but it did nothing of the kind. It just sat there, glowing brightly, but still obstinately present. Smoke poured from the bearings of the Eradicator as it started to overheat. Cease eradication, ordered Pletrak hurriedly. The hum of the Eradicator died down. The glow faded from the scope. It appeared quite unharmed. The silence was broken by Calic. Bravo! He said ironically. The machine must be armoured, spluttered Pletrak. There must be protective force fields. We have lost face, said Calic coldly. Our technology has proved inefficient. Timidly, Oram said, the Eradicator was designed primarily for use against organic substances. Pletrak looked hopefully at him. So the creatures inside the scope? Organic. The Eradicator will certainly have destroyed them. Pletrak gave Calic a satisfied look. Good. That was our objective. The scope in itself is unimportant. I shall report that the operation has been successful. He strode away. Vorg and Sherna were examining the scope. was still a little warm to the touch, but that was all. "Really built, eh?" said Vorg admiringly. "None of your modern rubbish." "Are you sure it isn't damaged?" asked Schöner sceptically. Vorg started to check the circuits. The doctor dragged Joe along the rest of the passage into a clearer space beyond. To his relief, the terrible vibration was dying down, and already it seemed to be getting cooler. He lowered Joe gently to the still warm floor. After a moment he muttered and stirred. He put an arm round her shoulders. "Come on, Joe, sit up." "Not yet, I'm only half cooked." Groggily, she got to her feet. "What happened?" "No idea. We were a bit of a hot spot for a while, weren't we?" "It's the giants. They know we're in their machine. They're trying to kill us." The doctor thought she might well be right, but there was no point in telling her so. "Nonsense," he said cheerfully. "Why should they attack us? We've done nothing to harm them." "Then what did happen?" "I've no idea. One problem at a time, eh? We've still got to find our way out of here. Let's try this way. It looks very promising." "Promising? Huh." Jo was mopping her brow with her handkerchief, which by now was little more than a sweat-soaked rag. She tossed it aside and followed the doctor. Ford gave the controls another twiddle and peered into his viewing aperture. At once he seemed to be on a bleak moonscape. Giant silvery figures with strange projecting handles for ears were striding towards him, but everything was fuzzy and blurred. Schöner looked over his shoulder. "That's marvellous. Who's going to pay us good credit bars to look at a blob in a snowstorm?" Vorg rubbed his hands. "The heat must have affected the vision circuit. Soon fix that. The main thing is the specimens are all right. Those protective force field must be really something." He didn't notice the grey figures of Calic and Aurum lurking behind a pillar. They had sidled closer to eavesdrop. They slipped away again. Once they were at a safe distance, Calic gave Aurum a reproving stare. "So the specimens were destroyed, Aurum. The machine must have built-in defensive force fields, as the humans said." "The scope is well defended," said Calic. "It is we who have no defences. President Zarb and his council of fools have betrayed us." Aurum glanced around. "That is dangerous talk, even for the president's brother." Calic lowered his voice. "Zarb has cut down our defensive forces. The Eradicator is our sole protection. Now we have just demonstrated its efficiency to those Lerman spies." "You really think the two Lerman are spies?" Calic looked at Aurum. What a gullible fool the fellow was. Of course Calic didn't believe Vorg and Schöner were spies, or rather, he didn't much care if they were spies or not. His aim was to use their presence to embarrass Pletric and his brother Zarb as much as possible. Calic enjoyed stirring up trouble for its own sake. He was determined to lose no opportunity of making political capital out of Zarb's error in allowing the aliens and their scope to land on the planet. Calic looked across at Vorg, who was fiddling about inside the scope. Perhaps at this very moment he's using a transmitter reporting our weaknesses to his masters. Aurum looked at him wide-eyed, summoning him with a nod to follow. Calic drew his blaster and moved stealthily towards the scope. Jo had been trailing after the doctor for what seemed like a very long time, and they were no nearer reaching an exit. She suspected they were lost, though naturally the doctor refused to admit it. They came to the mouth of a large shaft, and suddenly Jo paused to pick up a crumpled scrap of cloth. "We're going round in circles, Doctor. Look, here's the handkerchief I dropped." The doctor looked at it. "I'm afraid you're right, Jo. Then we're lost, said Jo hopelessly. "No, of course not. Just a little mislaid." Tell you what, we'll try a new tack. The doctor looked around, racking his brains. Suddenly he snapped his fingers. Got it! You see that bulge in the wall there? That must be part of the housing for the impeller vanes. Joe gave him a tearful look. Makes me feel much better knowing that. The doctor grinned. I thought it would, you see. That means there must be an air duct nearby. And where is air ducted from? Outside, said Joe hopefully. Right. Joe wiped the tears from her eyes. Sorry to be in such misery, Doctor. It's just this terrible feeling that we're not getting anywhere. I know, our trouble is we're walking about the inside of the blueprint instead of looking down at it. Joe screamed. A colossal steel spike was moving along the shaft towards them. The doctor grabbed Joe and they flattened themselves against the wall. The shaft slid by them and probed about a little and then withdrew. Relieved, Joe watched it go. She screamed again. From far down the shaft an enormous eye was peering at her. Vorg straightened up from the scope service panel. He put down his screwdriver and rubbed a hand across his eyes. You know, Shona, I'm not given to seeing things, but for a moment I thought there were 2 Terrans actually in the works. Shona didn't answer. Vorg glanced up to find Calic's blaster inches from his head. Slowly, Vorg, and said Calic threateningly. Vorg turned and straightened up. Orm was holding a blaster on Shona. All right, said Orm with quavering determination. Where is your transmitter? Vorg wondered if everyone was going mad. Your worship, I know nothing of any transmitter. What are you doing here? Snapped Calic. Minor adjustments, just silly little minor adjustments. There was a fault in the video circuits, confessed Shona eagerly. Nothing of consequence, your worships, he pleaded Vorg. Nothing at all. Calic waved his blaster. Orm, search that cavity. Orm knelt and peered dubiously inside the scope. Calic said, If he finds a transmitter in there, Vorg, you're dead. Vorg groaned and Shona put her arm around him. What's all this about a transmitter, Shona? He whispered. Shona shrugged. Search me. I suppose he means a beam pulsar, you know, for sending messages. We haven't got one in the scope, have we? You ought to know. You told me you're an electronics expert. Vorg sighed. Well, I'm not really an expert, to tell you the truth. I've never really understood these technicalities. He caught sight of Calic's blaster again and shivered. Would your worship be kind enough to move that away? It's very frightening. Orm's muffled voice came from inside the scope. It's rather dark in here. One can see little. Search, Orm, ordered Calic impatiently. If there is a transmitter, it will be disguised. Orm straightened up. There is only this. He held a tiny blue box in his hand. Aha, said Calic, giving a Vorg an accusing look, and said, What is that? Mere bric-a-brac, your worship, loose material, found it inside the circuit some time ago. Better keep it inside the scope, or... It was too late. Orm felt the blue box move in his hand, and he dropped it in a panic. It fell to the ground, and there was a fearsome groaning sound, and the box grew, expanding rapidly to the size of a police box, which is what it was, at least on the outside. Nearby functionaries fled in panic. Calic blanched, but held his ground, jabbing his blaster in Vorg's ribs. Bric-a-brac. All right, what's this? Let's have the truth. I tell you, I found it, said Vorg. It was causing interference. Orm approached the blue box cautiously. Perhaps it's a secret weapon. Why did it expand in size? I tried to warn you. You took it out of the scope's compression field. Left it out too long, after a minute or two, things regain their normal size. If only you hadn't... It is an alien artifact, said Carrick. How did it get in there? Before she could stop herself, Shona blurted out, "The Terrans! It must have been the new Terrans, Borg." She looked at the officials. "I saw 2 new Terrans, strangers in Circuit 3. Borg managed to smile. "Your worships, my assistant is an imaginative child." "Silence!" ordered Carrick. "Oram, is it possible for Terrans to conceal themselves in this device?" Oram looked doubtful. "It would be possible for our technology. Terrans may be more... Wouldn't be possible for our technology. Terrans may be more advanced." Callig nodded. Things were building up nicely. "The Terrans are not even from our galaxy. Who knows what new diseases they may bring with them?" Callig knew that rumour about the new space plague was a sure way to spread panic on Inter Minor, and if they had some exit from that machine... Borg tried to redeem the situation. "Your worships need have no fear. Each group of specimens is enclosed in a separate living zone. The scope is completely and utterly escape-proof." Joe and the doctor had found the air duct at last, after much wearily clambering over, under and between inner workings of the scope. Once the duct had been found, they had wiggled inside it and wormed their way along its narrow length, only to find the far end blocked by a heavy metal hatch. Joe groaned in despair. The doctor studied the hatch thoughtfully. "Don't worry, it's not as formidable as it looks. If I can cut through the locking bar here..." "I suppose you've got a file in your pocket." "Well, as a matter of fact..." The doctor fished out a length of metallic string, looped it around the bar, and began sawing it to and fro. "String file," he explained airily. Joe smiled. No doubt the doctor felt he'd evened up things for her skeleton keys. The doctor sawed away patiently. Some while later, Joe leaned forward to inspect his progress. "It's nearly through," he said encouragingly. The doctor rubbed his aching wrist. "So am I," she groaned. The locking bar gave way at last. The doctor moved it aside and opened the hatch. "Think I'd better go first. We don't really know what's out there." He climbed through the opening. "The TARDIS, I hope," muttered Joe as she followed him. The doctor helped her down on the other side. Joe looked around astonished. She wasn't in a machine at all now. She was in a cave. Through its entrance she could see a steaming, swampy, featureless landscape stretching away into the distance. I have gone on the next page, haven't I? Yes, I have. 63, 64. Cave. Pletrek had returned to the cargo bay and was listening to the story of recent events. He looked at the TARDIS with severe disapproval. "We really cannot have this sort of thing. Regulations are quite clear on the subject." Volk did his best to reassure him. "I assure you, your worship, if the scope is handled properly, it's as safe as the Bank of Deimos." Shona saw a light flickering on the scope's control panel and called Vorg over. "Another fault," she whispered. "In Circuit 5 this time." Vorg was aware of the officials watching him keenly. "No doubt some insignificant electrical matter," he said lightly. "Switch on the circuit, my dear." Shona obeyed, and everyone crowded to the viewing apertures. Vorg noted sourly that the 3 officials, however much they disapproved of the scope, were as keen as anyone to savour its excitements. The spectator saw, or rather seemed to be in, a steamy, featureless landscape, a mixture of marshland and swamp. Thick mist drifted across it, and bubbling mud geysers made sinister glugging sounds. Vorg spoke without looking up. working perfectly, you see, nothing wrong at all. Schöner looked at the control panel. It's still signalling the alarm. Calix said, what do you call the creatures who inhabit this singularly unpleasant landscape? A note of real enthusiasm came into Vorg's voice. Drashings, your worship. My little carnivores. Great favourites with the kiddies they are, snapping and gnashing and tearing up at each other. Schöner gave a scream. Vorg, look! Two figures, one small, one tall, had appeared. They were walking uncertainly across the marshlands, looking cautiously around them. The new Terrans, muttered Vorg. They've broken through into Circuit 5. Schöner gave Vorg one of her nudges. You've got to get them out. How can I? They're already as good as dead. Once the Drashings pick up their scent, they won't stand a chance. They'll be torn to pieces. Fascinating, murmured Calix. He leaned over into his viewing aperture. After they had been walking for what seemed like a very long time, the doctor stopped and looked about him. The misty marshland stretched all around him, exactly the same view in every direction. Every now and again the swamp belched out puffs of stinking marsh gas. This is hopeless, Joe. There's nothing here. Certainly not the TARDIS. I don't feel that this is the place. Joe shivered, and despite the clammy heat, neither do I. Let's go back. They turned and started to retrace their steps. At his control panel viewing aperture, Vorg shook his head sadly. They'll never make it. Blood-curdling roar echoed through the swamp. Joe and the doctor stopped. What was that? Joe whispered. The doctor shook his head. No idea, but it didn't sound too friendly. Come on, Joe, let's get back to the cave. The doctor took the flare pistol from his pocket. Just ahead the swamp began to bubble and seethe. A huge blunt head with a long scaly neck burst through the mud, swinging its head to and fro in search of prey. The Drashings let out a thunderous bellow. Hello, Alan. Onwards to chapter 7 as I've got time. Nothing escapes the Drashings. Joe thought she'd never seen anything more terrifying in her life. The creature was something between a dinosaur and a dragon, with a squat body, powerful clawed legs, sinuous neck, and a mouth that seemed to contain not 2, but at least a dozen rows of enormous razor-edged teeth. The eyes were small and blinking, the nostrils huge and flared. The monster launched itself across the mud like an express train, hurtling straight towards them. The doctor raised his flare pistol in a futile gesture of defiance. The monster shot past in a shower of mud like an express train that wasn't due to stop. Joe could hardly believe they were still alive. Why didn't it attack us, Doctor? I don't think they saw us, Joe. You saw those eyes and those nostrils. Visibility's poor here, and those things have adapted. They must hunt purely by scent. It's still following our outward trail. There were more bellowings, distant but getting nearer. Sounds as if there's more than one of them, said the doctor. Come along, Joe. We've got to beat the monster back to the cave. Schöner looked up from the scope. It's all right, Vorg. They're escaping. Vorg shook his head mournfully. Nothing escapes the Drashings, even miniaturized they terrify me. Plectrak looked up, shaken by what he'd seen. How many of these Drashings are there? Oh, just a small colony, 20 or so. And where do they come from? Oh, one of the satellites of Grundle. Vorg lowered his voice impressively. It is said that many years ago a battle thruster was forced to land there for emergency repairs. It had a crew of 50, all the latest armament, and they thought they could stand off the drashings for a while they fixed the ship. What happened? Asked Pletrak, fascinated despite himself. Nothing more was heard of them, so a spy orbiter was sent to scan the planet. The pictures showed almost nothing left of the battle cruiser. It had been eaten. As for the crew, even Calic was impressed. Eaten? They ate a spaceship? Apart from a few scraps of the reactor ventricle, drashings are omnivorous, you see. Their digestions can cope with anything. Mind you, added Vorg, they prefer flesh when they can get it. The Doctor and Joe were running through the swamp, and bellowing of the drashings came from all around, and it was getting closer. They were being encircled. A roaring drashing burst out of the swamp ahead of them, then another, and another. Joe and the Doctor stood quite still. The drashings waved their heads to and fro, searching, peering with little eyes, sniffing with huge nostrils. Doctor, they'll see us in a minute. That'll pick up our scent if they charge at once. The Doctor knew she was right. They might hope to dodge one of the short-sighted monsters, but never all three. The Doctor felt the weight of the flare pistol in his hand, a puny weapon against such terrors, and yet there was another eruption beneath the swamp, another whiff of stinking marsh gas. The Doctor sniffed, analysing the contents of the smell. Mostly hydrogen, he muttered. That should be highly flammable. Then everything happened at once. The three drashings caught their scents altogether. Three bellowed and charged. There was another eruption of marsh gas just in front of the charging drashings. The Doctor fired the flare pistol into the heart of it. The marsh gas eruption turned into a volcano of flame, enveloping the drashings, bellowing in rage and pain. They turned and fled, hiding from the flames beneath the swamp mud. The Doctor threw aside the empty flare pistol. They turned and ran for the cave. It came in sight at last, just as they began a stumbling run for its entrance. Another drashing burst from the mud, barring their way. As the monster did see them, it opened its mouth, roared terrifyingly, and charged. This time there was no marsh gas and no flare pistol to save them. Calig looked accusingly at Vorg. It is your duty to help the Terrans. Me, your worship? Vorg backed away. Put my hand inside with the drashings? You are in charge of the machine. It is your responsibility. Oh, go on, urged Sherna. We can't let them be torn to pieces. The drashing was opening its mouth to swallow the Doctor and Joe when a giant hand appeared from the sky and battered it away. The drashing flew through the air to land splashing and roaring some distance away. The hand hurriedly withdrew, and Doctor and Joe sprinted for the cave. Once they were safely inside, Joe gasped, "That hand, Doctor!" "We'll discuss that later," said the Doctor hurriedly. "Let's get back into the machine." He helped Joe through the little gap at the back of the cave. They wriggled down through the air duct and started moving through the machine once more. When they came to a fairly open space between two huge circuits, Joe sank to the ground. "Sorry, Doctor. I've just got to have a rest." The Doctor sat beside her. "I seem to be feeling the centuries a little myself." Joe yawned. "That swamp we were in, it wasn't the real outside, was it?" "No, it was another simulated environment, just like the ship. Isn't it time you told me where we are, Doctor?" The Doctor sighed. He'd have to break it to her sooner or later. "We're inside a miniscope, Joe. Scope for short." "Inside a what?" "But what I was saying about a boy with a bucket. You've seen those glass cases people keep colonies of ants in?" Joe gave him a horrified look. You mean Major Daly and all those people on the ship are specimens in some kind of peep show, and outside they're just people, creatures, looking at them for kicks? That's terrible. Well, thoughtless, maybe, said the doctor gently. Did you ever visit a zoo, keep a goldfish in a glass bowl? That's different. We're not animals. We are to the people out there, Joe. The doctor gave a very fair imitation of the showman's patter. Roll up, see these fascinating little animals in their native habitat. Watch their little funny tricks, poke 'em with a stick, make 'em jump. Stop it, Doctor, it isn't funny. I agree with you, Joe, said the doctor seriously. In fact, I had a great deal to do with getting these miniscopes banned. I persuaded the Time Lords they were an offence against the dignity of sentient life forms. I thought the Time Lords never interfered. The doctor chuckled. They don't usually, but I refused to shut up until they agreed to have scopes outlawed by intergalactic convention. Officially, they were called in and shut down. So how come we're inside one? Somehow this one must have been missed, and unfortunately the TARDIS materialised inside its compression field. Joe sighed. So here we are, all nicely wrapped up with all the other specimens. The doctor clapped her on the shoulder. Cheer up, Joe, we'll get out of here. An echoing roar in the distance brought them both to their feet. They hurried on their way. Outside the cave in the swamplands, half a dozen drashings were milling savagely around, fighting and clawing each other. They poured into the cave. Struggling in the confined space, they made for the open hatchway in the rear. Schurner glanced up from the scope. Vorg, come and look. Some of the drashings are trying to follow the Terrans. Vorg looked and shuddered. I should have known drashings never leave a scent. Not with any kind of meal at the end of it. I suppose they'll get out of the circuit, Vorg. Anything could happen. Schurner lowered her voice in a terrified whisper. They might even get out of the scope. Vorg looked round uneasily. You'll keep your thoughts to yourself, my girl. We're in quite enough trouble already. The first drashig found the hatchway at the end of the cave too small. Seizing the edge of the metal in its mighty jaws, it ripped it like someone opening a sardine can. Slavering ferociously, it enlarged the hole, tearing off great chunks of the metal. When the space was big enough, it squeezed through, roaring triumphantly. More drashings followed. The terrifying chorus of their howls reached Joe and the doctor as they staggered ant-like through the interior of the machine, desperately looking for a way out. Behind them they could hear the monsters coming even closer. They broke into a tired run. We've got one advantage, Joe, said the doctor encouragingly as they squeezed past a piston. We're smaller than they are. That's an advantage? Well, at least we can make better time in these narrow spaces. Just as the doctor spoke, they came to a dead end. A drashing bellowed behind them. Start climbing, Joe, ordered the doctor. A chain led into the darkness above them. They started to climb it, using the huge links like rungs of a ladder. The doctor swung himself on the top of the valve casing and pulled Joe after him. From below came echoing roars as the viciously determined drashings ravaged around there, seeking their prey. They'll find their way up here soon, said Joe hopelessly. Those things never give up. Then neither shall we, said the doctor. Come on, Joe. We're not done for yet. After ages of twisting and turning and clambering through the cramped spaces between the machinery, they seemed to leave the drashings behind for at least a while. They came up to a horizontal shaft, stretching beneath them like a great canyon. Logically, there's an extractor at the bottom of that shaft, said the doctor. That really will lead to the outside. Joe peered over the edge. Too far to jump, too smooth to climb. Now what? There came more bellows from behind. The Drashings were still on their trail. The doctor had produced a pencil and paper and was trying to work out a rough sketch map of the inside of the scope. We need a bit of lateral thinking, Joe. What's that? Sort of sideways approach. Use it when there aren't any logical answers. The doctor pointed to his map. You see, we can't go forward because of the drop, and we can't go back because... More shattering roars nearer this time. It made it unnecessary for him to finish. I get it, said Joe. We just go sideways. Don't be so literal, Joe. If we go sideways, the doctor peered at his map again, we'll end up back at the ship. There you are then, said Joe triumphantly. There's rope on the ship. I saw coils of it in the hold. We'll use the rope to get down the shaft. You're brilliant, Doctor. Am I? Joe grinned. Lateral thinking, when in doubt, go sideways. Clambering across the circuits and squeezing in and out of narrow spaces, they finally came to one of the octagonal plates through which they'd first entered the machine. The doctor wriggled it up against the access shaft and opened it with the core extractor. He slid the hatch back and peered through. To his surprise and delight, he had come up not outside Daly's cabin, but in the hold itself. Here's a piece of luck, Joe. We've arrived just in the right place. He helped her through the hatch, and they made their way over to the coils of rope. How much do we need? Whispered Joe. One of these bigger coils should do. The roar of a hungry Drashing came from below them. The doctor slipped the coil of rope over his shoulder. Come on, Joe. I don't think there's much time. Light streamed in the hatchway as the deck was thrown open. Joe caught a glimpse of feet descending, and the doctor dragged her into hiding. She heard the voice of Lieutenant Andrews. I can't see anything wrong here, sir. Major Daly's voice. Heard it plainly, I tell you. Sounded like the hound of Bally Baskervilles. Are you sure it came from the hold, sir? Positive, old boy, positive. Maybe some of the cargo shifted, suggested Andrews. Made some kind of groaning sound as it rolled. He glanced round the hold, looking for anything out of place. Then he spotted something, a projecting foot. Oh, well, best forget it, said Daly. Must be hearing things. Too long at sea. Thank goodness it's Bombay tomorrow. Glad I look forward to a tub of fresh water. The old briny might be all right for the fish. Using Daly's chatter as cover, Andrews crept forward until he was close enough to leap on Joe and drag her from her hiding place. Daly was astonished. I say, little Mem, sir, he exclaimed. He showed no sign of recognizing her. All right, said Andrews grimly. When did you two stow away? Joe sighed. Here we go again. Andrews took her by the arm. You'd better come with us. The doctor was hiding close by, quite close to Joe, but content with his capture. Andrews made no attempt to search further. The doctor considered rescuing her, but decided against it, at least for the moment. The job of going into the Drashing-infested scope and climbing down the shaft was one he'd as soon tackle alone. Now that they were out of their artificially aggressive state, there was little danger that the people on the ship would harm her. Once he himself was free, he'd find some way to get her out. The doctor started gathering up coils of rope. Joe was taken to the saloon, allowed to sit down and given a glass of orange squash, which she soon downed gratefully. The atmosphere this time was quite friendly. Her arrival seemed to be regarded as an amusing curiosity. Claire Daly poured her another glass of squash. Why don't you tell John how you got on board, she said. He's really quite nice, you know. I'm sure he is, said Joe. but I'm afraid he'd never believe me. She looked curiously at Claire. How long have you been on this ship? Nearly 4 weeks. Why? Joe leaned forward. Doesn't it ever seem like ages? Don't you ever feel like you've been doing the same things time and time again? For a long moment, Claire stared at her. It seemed as though some memory might be breaking through, and then she shook her head most angrily. I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. Joe smiled. Never mind, she said gently. Andrews came into the room. The captain wants to see you, young lady. Joe got up. Oh, well, anything for a change. Andrews was puzzled by her attitude. He's certain to put you under arrest, he warned. Last time he was too busy to even see me. Andrews looked scared, curiously at her, as if haunted by some fugitive memory. Last time? A drashig roar, now terrifyingly close, interrupted them. Daly turned to Andrews. You see, my boy, I was right. There was something in the hold. The two men ran from the room. His coil of rope over his shoulder, the doctor was about to leave by the octagonal hatch when he heard the roar. It was no more than a few feet away. The roar came again, and then again. A drashig thrust its head through the steel wall of the hull like a circus animal bursting through a paper hoop. Oof. Now I'm going to end there briefly, but I'll come back in a sec with chapter 8. Now at this point the numbering situation gets slightly complicated. We're now on part 7, but it's chapter 8 of the book. But I'm going to have to pause after this because it's almost time to eat. Battle on the ship. Many-fangled head weaved around in darkness of the hold. The beady, short-sighted eyes focused on the doctor. The drashing hurled itself with a roar. The doctor dodged to one side. The hatchway was flung open, and Andrews, Daly, and half a dozen seamen, all armed with rifles, found themselves staring straight at the charging drashing. I don't believe it, spluttered Daly. Andrews was more practical. Fire! He yelled. Andrews and Daly led the seamen in a ragged volley. Screaming with pain and rage, the drashings hurled itself bodily across the hold and burst out of the hatch onto the deck. Scattering men to all sides, in its progress it knocked down a pile of crates, most of which landed on top of the doctor. Andrews and Daly picked themselves up and made for the salon, where Claire and Joe were waiting, terrified. Did you see the doctor? Called Joe. Andrews ignored her. You stay here, Major, he called. Look after the ladies. Andrews ran up on deck. The drashing had made its way forward and was rampaging across the decks. The captain and a grim-faced group of seamen stood by with both rifles, waiting for a shot at it. As Andrews arrived, a seaman came running up with a heavy Thompson machine gun. The captain took it. Now we should be able to settle it, he said. This thing'll stop anything. I know where there's something even more useful, sir, called Andrews. Dynamite in the aft hold. Good man, said the captain. See what you can do. Andrews dashed away. The drashing changed its course and started moving towards them. Daly stuck his head out of the salon window and called to the captain. Take cover here, sir. You can fire through the window. The captain ran into the salon with a machine gun. Daly already had the salon portholes thrown wide open. Claire and Joe were sheltering behind a sofa. Daly immediately took charge with the assurance of an old military man. It was 10 years since he'd seen action on the Western Front, but he was still ready to do his best. Firmly he took the submachine gun from the captain. If you'll just let me have that, sir, I'll take the main charge here, and you can post riflemen on the deck. Some each of the salon. I think that might be a misprint. The doctor nodded and ran out. Daly waited, grim-faced, as the drashing
roars came nearer. Suddenly the monster's slavering head appeared at the salon window. Claire screamed. Daly fired a long, raking burst of the submachine gun, pouring its entire magazine of .45 caliber bullets into the Drashing's body. At the same time, the captain and crew were firing their rifles into flanks. Not even a Drashing could stand up such a hail of bullets. Torn almost to pieces, the monster lurched back, roaring, and collapsed on the edge of the deck. The weight of the body slammed through the deck. The deck rails, and the dying monster slithered slowly into the sea. Everyone stopped shooting, and an uncanny silence fell. Only the blood-stained, bullet-torn deck showed that a battle had just taken place. In the hold, the doctor, half stunned, was struggling from beneath his pile of crates. He saw a kneeling figure crouched over a wooden box, breaking the wire binding around the lid. It was Andrews. There came a shattering roar. Another Drashing was forcing its way through the shattered wall. Andrews spun around, lit the fuse on a stick of dynamite, and the doctor struggled to his feet. "No, don't! You'll wreck the scope and kill us all!" Andrews hurled the splattering dynamite stick at the Drashing. The dynamite exploded in mid-air, blowing the monster back down the shaft. Andrews lit a second stick, threw it, and then turned and ran from the hold. The second stick of dynamite went off halfway down the shaft, exploding devastatingly in the confined space. There was a brilliant white flash and a prolonged roar. The doctor went to the gap. Smoke was drifting upwards, and molten metal trickled down the walls. "Oh dear," said the doctor. "Now that's really done it." He wondered again about going back for Joe, but decided against it. Judging from the silence, the Drashings were beaten off for the moment. Joe would be far safer where she was than where he was going. Settling the rope round his shoulders, the doctor opened the octagonal hatch and began to climb down the shaft. Joe was just about to slip out of the salon and look for the doctor when Daly came back from his inspection of the deck. "Sorry about the fuss, my dear," he said calmly. "I'm sure the captain won't keep you very long. By Jove, that beast took a bit of a stropping, eh? Think we all deserve a chotter peg." Suiting the action to the word, Daly poured himself a stiff drink. Claire looked up, shuddering. "What a terrible beast. I've never seen anything like it, have you?" Daly shook his head solemnly. "Well, I have," said Joe. "There are quite a lot of them about." Daly nodded. "Strange waters these, my dear. Always said so." Joe shuddered, becoming impatient with the banal conversation. She tried to slip past Daly, but he put a restraining arm, blocking the doorway. "Please let me go," she said pleadingly. "I've got to find the doctor." "Feeling a bit uppity," said Daly sympathetically. "Not surprising after all you've been through. We'll get the ship's doctor to take a look at you soon." "Not the ship's doctor," said Joe. "My doctor." "Oh, never mind." Andrews came into the salon. He'd changed into a fresh uniform. It was his immaculate self. Daly looked up. "Hello, old chap. Sundowner?" Claire looked up, her face calm and composed again. "Daddy, John and I are going for a walk around the deck." Andrews smiled. "That's right. 20 times around the deck is a mile. Coming, Claire?" Joe stared at them with a mixture of amusement and horror. They were settling calmly back into their old grooves again. Things weren't exactly the same, but near enough. No doubt everything would be back in its unvarying normal. "You've forgotten everything, haven't you?" she burst out. Daly turned and stared at them, whiskey glass in hand. "'Pon my soul!" "And who might you be?" demanded Andrews sternly. Joe looked at him defiantly. "How do you know I'm not a passenger? None of you can remember anything more than 10 minutes back, so how do you know?" Joe could feel herself getting hysterical. She stared wildly around the salon. Can't you remember me? Don't you remember fighting that monster?" Claire Daly gave a pitying look. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about." Monster? What monster? Daly chuckled. Seen the sea serpent, have you? We were attacked by a monster, said Joe desperately. I was with you when you shot it down. Before any of them could stop her, she rushed blindly from the salon. Daly drained his drink and poured another. Poor girl must be suffering from a touch of the sun. Andrews nodded. Still can't have stowaways running around. I'd better round her up. As he walked from the salon, Daly called, Look out for that monster, old chap. Claire smiled to herself. Monsters? All the absurd ideas. Pletrak, Calic and Oram were engaged in another of their unending conferences on the subject of Vorg and Scherner and their scope. Calic, as usual, was being awkward. According to the law, the Lermans should have been deported and their species destroyed. Or was Oram... It was Oram who asked the unanswerable question. How? How indeed, said Pletrak. Since the Eradicator has no effect, we should deport both Lermans and the machine. It is not within the authority of this tribunal, objected Calic. To that you must obtain special powers, President Zarb. Pletrak sighed wearily. That will take some time. No doubt, but it is the correct procedure. Pletrak sighed wearily. Very well, I will seek special powers from Zarb. Make sure the Eradicator functionaries remain alert. Pletrak bustled away. Calic smiled, and Oram stared wonderingly at him. Over by the scope, Scherner was looking at a flashing light on the control panel. Vorg, there's another fault signalled. Vorg shrugged. Minor blockage in one of the feed lines. It'll correct itself. That minor blockage is probably a Drashig, said Scherner. Look. We switched over to Circuit 5. The area around the cave in the marshes was completely deserted. See? Not a Drashig in sight. Nothing unusual in that, Vorg's voice was defensive. Little dears are shy. What they're like, they'll mill around for hours after a kill. Some of these Drashings are loose inside the scope. They're roaming out of their circuit. Cold voice spoke from behind them. The machine had become dangerous since it was Calic. Oram as ever by his side. Both had slipped up quietly. Vorg waved a dismissive hand. Oh, no, your worship, not at all. Oh, tell him the truth, said Scherner wearily. What does it matter now? We think some of the Drashings have broken out of their circuit. They followed the Terrans into the cave, and they haven't come out again. Where does the cave lead, said Scherner. Down into the supply lines. There's a control valve at the back. Well, said Vorg angrily, if the Drashings have got out. I'm not saying for a moment they have. Whose suggestion was it that I should help the Terrans to escape, Scherner? Mine, said Calic. A most merciful and compassionate suggestion too, your worship, said Vorg swiftly. Oram looked strangely at Calic. Merciful and compassionate. You, Calic? Calic smiled coldly. One has twinges. Oram and Calic strolled up to the official ramps and stood viewing the busy spaceport. There was no one to hear them. There was no one near them. Quietly, Oram said, You expect these Drashings to follow the escaping Terrans? They follow a scent forever, never give up. Or so Vorg tells us. If the Terrans escape from the machine, the Drashings will follow them. What is to be gained by that? Possibly the world. Calic's voice was low and fanatical. Since the great space plague, we have stood alone and been strong. Now Zarb is changing our ways. Oram protested. But the functionaries are restless. Maybe we need change. What we need, Oram, is something to unite us. We need a leader. We need a war. And who will give us all this? I will, said Calic quietly, by leading a rebellion against my brother Zarb. And with that we reach page 86, and I'm going to take a break.
Well, we're back. Did sort of mean to try and do this yesterday, but Brighton was very windy, and I couldn't find anywhere out of noise and peace and quiet and wind and traffic and what have you. So took this book all the way to Brighton and back. Hello, Alan. So onwards with chapter 9 of Carnival of Monsters. Although there was no one nearby, Orem looked anxiously about him. Zarb's position is secure. How will you achieve rebellion? Suppose these drashings escape from the scope and cause havoc in the city. Who would be blamed? President Zarb. The scope and the drashings are here only because of his liberal policies. No doubt feeling would spring up with a little calculated encouragement, but you forget the Eradicator. Once they leave the scope's protective force field, the Eradicator can destroy the drashings with ease. Calig nodded. True, Orem. If it is in working order, come. Calig led the way down the ramp. He strolled up to the Eradicator functionaries and dismissed them. Since they were mere functionaries, and he was an official, they obeyed without question. He turned to Orem. You have technical knowledge. Remove some small part, but vital part. Nervously, Orem slipped behind the Eradicator, returning moments later with a serrated crystal strip. This is the Trizone focuser. The Eradicator is useless without it. They had achieved their piece of sabotage just in time. Pletrak came back bustling across the spaceport. President Zarb has granted our tribunal special powers, he announced importantly. The two Lermans and their scope are to be deported. A special transporter is being arranged. Calig pointed to the TARDIS. And the Terran container? That will be deported too, and jettisoned in deep space. Suddenly Pletrak noticed that the Eradicator was unguarded. Where are the functionaries? In the guard block, said Calig. One relieved them of duty. They appeared fatigued. Pletrak turned to Orem. Fetch them at once. Orem scurried away. You have exceeded your authority, Calig, Pletrak went on. There will be an inquiry. Is that clear? Perfectly, Chairman Pletrak, perfectly clear. With an insolent nod, Calig strolled across the spaceport towards the alcove with the scope. He saw Vorg and Scherner leaning over it, and moved quietly closer, finally reaching a position behind a pillar where he could listen unobserved. Look at all these dials, Vorg, he heard Scherner say. Then Vorg's voice. What about them? They're suddenly dropping lower, all of them. It's a general power failure. Vorg stared at the dials, shaking his head unbelievably. The generators are built by the old Eternity Perpetuity Company, designed to last forever. That's why the company went bankrupt. He bent over the dials, adjusting the controls. Something pretty drastic must have happened in there, he grumbled. It'll take an explosion to do this much. Turn the page. Hello, Bill. Scherner watched him. Those dials are still dropping. They'll soon be down to a critical point. Vorg looked up. There should be enough power in the circuits to keep them ticking over for a while. Long enough to repair it? Perhaps. If only I hadn't lost the manual. Scherner gave him a disgusted look, and Calig stepped up out of hiding. The scope was a vital part of his plan. He didn't want anything going wrong with it. Not yet, at any rate. Not until those drashings had escaped. What is the matter? He asked. Vorg gave a guilty stare. Oh, just routine maintenance, your worship. I have reconsidered my position, said Calig. Lying smoothly, I have made recommendation that you be allowed to stay. President Zarb is favourably considering it. However, if your machine is no longer in working order, a minor fault, your worship, nothing more. I shall repair it at once. Vorg leapt towards the tool bag. But the damage to the scope was far beyond repair, as the doctor could have witnessed. Picking his way through the complex machinery's interior, he was appalled at the amount of destruction. The explosion of Andrews's dynamite seemed to have set off a chain reaction all around him. The great metal shapes were twisted and warped. The steady pulsating glow of valves had become an erratic flickering, and the low hum of power an agonized groan. Stretched across one circuit, the doctor found the scarred body of a drashing. The creature had bitten through a power cable and had paid the penalty. No doubt there was more of them roaming in the works, doing incalculable damage as their savage teeth chewed through metal and plastic. The doctor reached the steep shaft he had found with Joe. He tied the end of his rope to a cross strut, tossed the coil over the edge, and began descending hand over hand into the depths. Down and down the doctor went into the darkness of the shaft. Soon he was encouraged by a faint glow of light at the very bottom, but before he reached it, the doctor's luck and his rope ran out. Swinging on the end of the rope, the doctor thought hard. He could climb all the way up the rope, go back to the ship, get more rope, then come back down again. The thought of going through all that was intolerable, not to mention the risks of being eaten by a drashing or captured by the ship's crew. Moreover, he was tiring now. He doubted if he'd had the strength to make it to the top again. The doctor took a calculated risk. According to his own estimations, he must be fairly near the bottom by now, and there must be only one way to find out. He flexed his knees, and he let go of the rope. The fall was a surprisingly short one. He bent his legs as he hit the bottom, rolled over on one shoulder like a parachutist. Picking himself up, he looked about. He was in a dark, empty space with metal walls, like an aircraft hangar. He guessed that he was now underneath the machinery and in the very bottom of the scope. He looked around and saw the gleam of light that he had spotted from the shaft and ran towards it. Let's just change page again. The gleam came from a slight gap caused by the buckling of a metal base plate. It was just wide enough to let him through. The doctor started squeezing through the gap. He was so intent on getting out that he gave little thought to what he might find on the other side. Not until he was through the gap did he straighten up and look around. The spectacle was terrifying. High above him, disappearing into nothingness, rose a sheer metal cliff, the outside wall of the scope. He was in a vast open space, through which moved giant forms of pushing enormous metal objects. Dizzy, the doctor spun around. Some huge shape was dominating the landscape before him. There was something familiar about it. Suddenly, the doctor realized what it was. He was looking at a giant golden boot. The boot rose and came down, and the doctor realized he was in danger of being crushed like an ant. He ran into the middle of the echoing confusion, desperate to escape, but his legs were giving way beneath him, and his head was spinning around. He stumbled and fell. The appearance of the doctor from the scope caused an even bigger sensation than the arrival of the TARDIS before him. No one had noticed the ant-like figure emerge from the base of the scope, but released from the scope's compression field, it started to grow and grow and grow. There was panic. Functionaries were fleeing in all directions, and the doctor grew only to normal size and did nothing more threatening than lay on the floor, unconscious, and the panic died down. Vorg, Schörner, and the 3 Minorian officials gathered around the body. The doctor began to stir, and Pletrak jumped back in panic. "Eradicator! Eradicator! Eradicator!" he shouted in alarm. The Eradicator functionaries had made off. Pletrak ran to fetch them back. The doctor struggled to a sitting position. He looked round, relieved to find himself normal size again. Leaning over him were 2 humanoids in tattered cold finery, 1 female and 1 male. The 2 male humanoids, in grey robes, were hovering nearby. Schörner put an arm down around the doctor's shoulders and helped him get up. "Feeling better, dear?" she said brightly. The doctor grinned at the homely remark. He stood up, swaying a little, and found himself looking into the mouth of an electronic cannon. A grey-robed humanoid, an older white-haired one this time, was giving orders to the brutish, ununiformed figures manning the gun. Vorg and Schöner jumped back instinctively. "Leave him alone," shouted Schöner. "He hasn't done anything. It's one of the Terrans from the scope." "It must be eradicated at once," ordered Pletrak. "Get away from it. It's probably crawling with alien germs." Swaying a little, the doctor stood alone. Eradicator trained on him at point-blank range, still half unaware of his danger. He was trying to make sense of the noise and confusion around him. He heard Vorg's voice. "Come away, Schöner. The noble master is right. The thing must be destroyed." Next page. He heard Pletrak's command. "Detachment, one charge at maximum intensity. Fire!" Too weak to dodge or run, the doctor looked straight down the muzzle of the Eradicator. And we're going to go on to Chapter 10. The doctor takes over. As the Eradicator functionary's finger was about to descend on the firing button, a thin, grey-robed figure stepped between the doctor and the muzzle of the cannon. Raising his hand, Kalek said, "Stop!" The functionary snatched his hand away. To fire upon an official would be unthinkable. Kalek exchanged a swift glance with the Tubby-Orum, who was hovering, as usual, on the sidelines, as they both knew the doctor was in no danger whatsoever, since the Eradicator had been sabotaged. But if Kalek's plan was to succeed, this must not be discovered until the drashings burst out of the scope. Therefore, the Eradicator must not be fired before then. And the doctor had to be saved. Kalek had taken his action on impulse. Now his agile brain was looking at ways to justify it. Pletrak hurried up, gobbling with rage. "Stand aside, Kalek." Kalek did not move. "This procedure is not in order. The Eradicator cannot be used without authority from President Zarb." "But surely in an emergency." "One alien does not constitute an emergency. The function of our tribunal is to keep this planet clean. The Terran creature is from outside our solar system and is a possible carrier of a contagion. Furthermore, the creature may well be hostile." To the next page. The doctor was recovering fast now. He was becoming rather tired of being discussed as though he wasn't there. He marched up to Pletrak and said, "Kindly stop referring to me as the creature, sir, or I may well become exceedingly hostile." Pletrak jumped away from the tall figure. "Silence, alien! The tribunal is deliberating." "The tribunal is not deliberating, it is wrangling, and quite nonsensically too, if I may say so." Pletrak was outraged. "I warn you, this tribunal will not tolerate insolent remarks from an unauthorized alien life form." Changing his tack, the doctor smiled down at the fussy little official. "I wonder if you'd be kind enough to tell me exactly where I am. What planet, I mean." "You're on Inter Minor," said Pletrak importantly. Surely this would impress the alien. The doctor looked dejected. "Not Metabelius 3, the famous blue planet of the Actian galaxy?" inquired sadly. "No." The doctor sighed, abandoning all hopes of winning his argument with Joe. "Oh, well, never mind." He walked over to the TARDIS and gave the blue box a pat. "Well, at least you're all right, old girl." Pletrak and the other officials had followed him. "This container is yours?" demanded Pletrak. "It is indeed," said the doctor, standing near the TARDIS. He saw another shape, a tall cylinder on legs, viewing apertures around all sides, and he strode across to it. "Just as I thought, a miniscope." He whirled round on Pletrak. "This is outrageous. Is this device yours?" So angry was the doctor's tone that Pletrak found himself replying defensively. "Certainly not. It is the property of the Lerman entertainment here. The female is his assistant." The doctor turned his stern gaze on the two entertainers and their shabby gold finery. He saw Schöner's worried face, remembering her earlier kindness, made a courtly bow. Schöner curtsied back, suppressing a nervous giggle. The doctor returned his attention to Pletrak. "I see. Well, I'll deal with them later. And you are? Chairman Platrack of the Alien Admissions Tribunal. One's colleagues are Commissioner Callick and Commissioner Oram. Apparently addressing the air, Callick said, "One wonders why the tribunal is submitting to questioning by the alien instead of questioning it. Surely that is the wrong way round." It took more than a little sarcasm to worry the doctor. He looked severely at the three grey-robed commissioners. "Well, gentlemen, I'm sorry to have to tell you that you're in serious trouble." Oram shook his head. "One is forced to admire the creature's audacity." Callig said nothing. He was weighing up the doctor, wondering how he could best make use of him. The doctor's own behaviour had been calculated from the very last. As long as Joe Grant was inside the scope, she was still in great danger. There was simply no time for all the nonsense of imprisonment and interrogation that usually followed the unexplained arrival on some alien planet. He had to dominate these Minorans from the start, force them to help him. Put to another page. Nothing less than Joe's life was at stake. He gave Chairman Platrack another unnerving frown. "I take it you and your commission are representatives of authority on this planet." "One's authority comes direct from President Zarb," said Platrack proudly, and the doctor deflated him. "Then yours is the responsibility. You have allowed the importation and operation of a device expressly forbidden by intergalactic law." "One did not allow it," protested Platrack. "One has already ordered the deportation of the entertainers and their machine." The doctor sighed wearily. His manner was that of some high court judge, all too used to seeing petty criminals trying to wriggle out of their responsibilities. "Nevertheless, the machine is here, and it's in operation. You'll scarcely deny that." Confused, Platrack stammered. "Well, strictly speaking, one is forced to concede the fact that, in a sense—" The doctor cut ruthlessly through the waffle. "Precisely. As a direct result of your carelessness, my young female companion is still inside that device. In a situation of extreme peril." Platrack made an attempt to fight back. "One is forced to remind you, alien, that the question before this tribunal is your own possible eradication as a menace to public health." The doctor went on as if Platrack hadn't spoken. "If you'll allow me to rescue my companion and do something for the other unfortunates imprisoned in that disgraceful device, I'm prepared to overlook the whole unfortunate business." "One is indeed overwhelmed," said Callick dryly. The doctor turned his back on them. "If not, well, you'll just have to take the consequences. Let me know when you've made up your minds." Folding his arms, the doctor gazed into space, as if the whole debate was only of minimal interest to him. But beneath his apparent calm, he was in turmoil, wondering if his bluff would work. His experienced eyes had summed up the Minorans very quickly, and he was gambling that, like all authoritarians, they would harass and bully anyone who seemed weaker than themselves, while responding favourably to a display of force and bluster. As the doctor waited, Vorg and Schöner were observing him. There was an expression of tremendous admiration on Vorg's face. Himself a born coward, terrified by all authority, he was lost in wonder at how this tall, elegant figure had dealt with the officials. "Marvellous," he breathed. "What audacity! You know, Schöner, I do believe he's one of us." "One of us? He's a Terran, isn't he?" "The Brotherhood of Showmen is intergalactic," said Vorg loftily. "He's got to be in the carnival business, Schöner. Look at his manner. Look at his clothes. I recognise the type, I tell you. I've worked with many a Terran fairground." Schöner looked wistfully at the doctor. "You may be right. He's certainly got the style. I'll lay wager on it. He's got the measure of those grey-faced fools right enough." Somehow Vorg drew courage from the doctor's defiance of officialdom. As usual, the official conference had ended in let's turn the page. In disagreement. Pletrack was for eradicating the Doctor. Pletrack was for eradicating the Doctor at once on grounds of general hygiene. Calic was desperate to stop any attempt to use the Eradicator, and Aurum, as usual, followed Calic. "Admit it, Pletrack," said Calic. "You are outvoted." As a good official, Pletrack had no choice but to defer to the decisions of his tribunal. "Oh, very well," he waved a hand. "Eradicator unit, stand down, but remain here. You may be needed." The Doctor had observed the decision with a well-concealed sigh of relief. He turned around. Thank you, gentlemen," he bowed to Calic, "and thank you, sir, for the most timely intervention." As the Doctor strode and turned away, Pletrack called, "Elian, where are you going?" The Doctor paused. "Just over here. I have work to do." He moved over to the scope and started examining it. Pletrack looked keenly at Calic. "One confesses one is puzzled, Calic. What use is this Terran to you?" Calic was wondering the same thing to himself, but he shrugged indifferently and said, "Of no possible use. You never do anything without a reason, Calic. One is wondering why you bothered to save the Terran's life." Calic gave his cold smile. "Out of mercy and compassion, Pletrack. Vorg will tell you." He strolled away, Aurum at his heels. Pletrack looked after them, worried. He decided to watch and wait. He would also send a message requesting more powers from President Zarb so as to resolve this intolerable situation. Vorg and Sherna watched from the background as the tall alien examined the scope. Despite the fact that the machine was their property, they lacked the courage to protest or even ask him what he was doing. Sherna said, "Go on, Vorg. Offer to help him. Maybe he'll put in a good word for us." Vorg plucked up his courage. "Perhaps you're right. I mean, he is a fellow showman." An idea struck him. "Here, I'll just see if he talks the Polari." Vorg was referring to the universal showman's slang, which had spread out from Terra across the galaxy. He sidled up to the Doctor and spoke in a low, confidential murmur out of the side of his mouth. "Polari the Carney, mate?" The Doctor looked up and raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon?" "Vada the Bonar Palone?" persisted Vorg. Unaware that he was being addressed in the secret language of Carnival showmen, the Doctor shook his head. Vorg leaned forward. "Niente denari Giles?" said Vorg, warning the Doctor that there must be no money to be made on Interminer. The Doctor sighed and spoke very slowly and clearly. "I'm sorry, I do not understand your language." Vorg gave him a nudge. "Come on, you understand all right. You're a showman, aren't you? Just like me." The Doctor looked thoughtfully at him, taking in the rather seedy flamboyance of the well-worn costume. "Oh, so you're a showman, are you?" Vorg swept in a splendid bow. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am the great Vorg, renowned intergalactic entertainer, and this is my assistant Sherna." The Doctor returned the bow. Delighted to meet you. I am called the Doctor." "That's right," said Vorg. "Nothing like the title. Doctors, professors, that always brings in a crowd. I knew you were a showman." The Doctor decided it wasn't worth trying to disillusion him. "I gather you're in charge of this device." "That's right. Something wrong?" "A great deal is wrong. A young friend of mine is still trapped in there, and I've got to find some way of getting her out. Now, where's the inspection hatch?" Vorg took it off for him. "I shouldn't put your hand inside, Doctor. Those drashings can take a lump out of you." "Drashings?" The Doctor frowned. "I take it that's the name of those creatures that attacked us in the swamp." Sherna nodded. "Trouble is, some of them followed you out of their own circuit. They seem to be running wild inside." "Doing terrible damage, aren't they, Vorg?" Vorg nodded sadly, looking at the flickering display of warning lights on the scope's control panel. "I reckon they've wrecked the stato fields. I'm probably going to lose the entire collection. Be a real tragedy, that would. My insurance doesn't cover replacement livestock." The Doctor looked at him appalled. "Livestock? Are you aware that there are human beings in there?" That's right, Terrans, Ogrons, Drashings, Cybermen, Ice Warriors, marvellous collection. The doctor lifted Vorg off his feet and shook him angrily. The collection is of the simplest animal life forms of a dubious enough pursuit at best, sir. But he gave Vorg another shake, rattling his teeth. But the collection of intelligent, civilized life forms is a positive crime. I warn you, I intend to put an end to this disgraceful machine of yours. He set Vorg down with a thump. Vorg backed hurriedly out of reach, smothering down his lapels. No need to get excited, he said reproachfully. Besides, you needn't worry about the scope. It's putting an end to itself. The doctor leaned over the control panel. Been trying to interpret the warning light display. Can you tell me exactly what it means? The machine's packing up, Vorg said glumly. It's as simple as that. All the life support systems are going to break down. It's just ticking over now, confirmed Cherner. The power level's almost down to critical. The doctor realized things were even worse than he feared. How long do you think it will last? Vorg shrugged. No idea. Can't be much longer. The doctor spoke almost to himself. When power drops below critical, the artificial life support systems will fail, and every living creature inside the scope will die. And this is where that's where we're leaving it for now. Hello Stu, thank you for watching. Hello Sonia, thank you for watching. If there's any more waves I can do. Yeah, I've waved at everybody. I'll be back later today. It will either be late this morning or early this afternoon with the final 2 chapters. Bye. Hello again. We've reached the conclusion of the book, chapters 11 and 12. Thank you everybody for joining me throughout the week. Hopefully do another one of these in August when I next have a week off. Chapter 11. Return to Peril. On board the SS Bernice, the hunt for Joe Grant went on. There was nothing very serious or dramatic about it. With the agrometer turned off, the passengers and crew had long ago reverted to their amiable selves. They weren't too worried about one very small girl's stowaway. The hunt was concluded rather like a jolly game of hide-and-seek with excited shouts whenever Joe was spotted and ran to some other hiding place. Neither Joe nor her pursuers knew of the danger which loomed over them all. Once the scope power dropped below critical, their artificial world would come to a sudden end. The tropical sun would go out, there would be no light, no warmth, and eventually no air. Their world, their lives, would end up in choking darkness. Hearing the sound of approaching feet, Jo jumped from the lifeboat where she had been hiding and sprinted across the deck. She ran to the chain locker, pulled it open, and squeezed inside. Her diminutive size was of great advantage in the game. Several times her pursuers had ignored her hiding places, assuming no one could squeeze into such a small place. She heard footsteps on the deck outside her chain locker, and Andrews's voice. "Any sign of her?" Daly's voice answered. "Not a buried trace, old boy." "Never mind, she's got to be somewhere. We'll just have to carry on looking." The footsteps moved away. Although the chain locker was a very good hiding place, it was also cold, dark, and damp, and Jo soon got bored with it. She decided to make for the hold. If the doctor came back to look for her, as sure as he eventually would, that would be the best place to wait for him. She slipped out of the locker and crept across the deck. No one was in sight. Andrews and Daly must be searching some other part of the ship. She found a hatchway, opened it, and climbed down into the darkness of the hold. Even in the dim light, she could see the devastation left by the Drashig attack. There was a great gaping hole in one wall, and boxes and crates were scattered everywhere. Surely Andrews and the others would notice all this, or possibly not. Their mental conditioning seemed to block out everything that didn't conform to their picture of ordinary shipboard life. Jo wondered if the doctor might still be hiding. Maybe he'd been wounded in the battle with the Drashings and was lying helpless somewhere. "Doctor?" she called softly. "Doctor, are you there?" Andrew stepped out from behind a pile of crates, grinning broadly. "Gotcha, my girl," he said cheerfully, and moved in front of the ladder, blocking her escape. "All right," said Joe, "I know the routine." Sure enough, the routine was exactly the same. She was taken first to the salon for a little chat with Major Daly and Claire, both of whom reacted as if they were meeting her for the first time, and then to Daly's cabin. Andrews unlocked the door and threw it open. "In you go, my girl. You'll be safe here until Captain can find time to see me, and that may be some time because he's a very busy man," chanted Joe. "All right, I know." Andrews gave her a rather puzzled look. "That's right, you just be a sensible girl." He closed and locked the door. Joe listened to the sound of his retreating footsteps. "Well, here we go again," she said, producing her skeleton keys. She got to work on the door. Lurking behind their usual pillar, Callig and Orem watched the doctor at work on the scope. "What is the Terran doing?" asked Orem with his mild curiosity. "Trying to rescue its companion, one imagines," said Callig impatiently. The strain of waiting was beginning to get on his nerves. The Drashings were being uncomfortably slow to get out of the scope and cause the havoc which Callig needed for the start of the revolution. The two Lermans and the scope were due to be taken off planet soon. It would be of no use to Callig if the Drashings' escape took place on some cargo rocket. It had to happen here, in the city. Orem watched fascinatingly as the doctor's coat off and sleeves rolled up worked feverishly. "The Terran is evidently concerned for its companion," he observed. "Clearly they are social creatures." "And harmless," Callig said calmly. "It would have suited his purposes better if the doctor had fangs and claws." Orem looked across to the Eradicator, where Pletrek stood obstinately on guard. "Pletrek is suspicious," he said, stating the obvious with his usual maddening calm. "If it occurs to him to check over the Eradicator, he will soon discover that one has rendered it useless." "You worry too much, Orem." "Possibly so, Callig, but President Zarb, liberal as he is, still enforces the death penalty for acts of treason." Callig considered. "Perhaps, Orem, you have a point," he conceded. "Do you have the parts you removed from the Eradicator?" "The Trizon focuser? Yes, I have it here." "Then we shall have to conceal it in Vorg's baggage," said Callig. "If anything does go wrong, one of us can always discover it." A slow smile spread across Orem's face. "Brilliant. We shall blame everything on Vorg. Then he will be the one to be executed." "Naturally," said Callig. "It is a fitting fate for an alien spy and saboteur." They began drifting closer to the scope. Vorg was watching worriedly as the doctor worked, head poked deep inside the scope's inspection hatch. "He could lose that long nose of his, just like that. If there's a Drashing about," Vorg made a snapping motion with his fingers. "Vorg, look!" Schurner pointed downwards. One of the base panels of the scope was vibrating regularly, as if someone was pounding against it from the inside. "There are Drashings about all right, Vorg. Down there they've reached the outer hull of the scope. If they get out, they'll expand to full size and..." Schurner's voice was rising hysterically. Vorg shushed her. "Come on, girl. This is where we beat it." Schurner hesitated. She was a kind girl and felt they ought to at least warn the doctor. Vorg pulled her away. "Never mind him. He's so high and mighty he can look after himself." With elaborate casualness, Vorg and Schurner began strolling across the spaceport. As they neared the Eradicator, Pletrek stepped out, barring their way. "Where are you going?" Well, yes," said Vorg. He looked appealingly at Schurner. "Where are we going?" "Home," said Schurner firmly. "Yes, indeed, precisely," gabbled Vorg. "We thought we'd find a Lerman freighter and hitch a ride back." "That will not be necessary. A special transporter has been ordered for you and your scope." Vorg shuddered at the thought of being shut up with a Drashing on a spaceship. "There really is no need," he said hurriedly. "We really need to just want to give you any trouble. We'll find our own way home. Tell you what, you can keep the scope. You're welcome to it." We do not wish to keep these scopes, said Pletrac severely. You and it will leave the planet in a special transporter. It's very kind of you, said Shannon, but really, not at all, said Pletrac. Rather tactlessly, he added. In any case, the transporter will be disinfected before further use. Disinfected, said Shona, outraged. Now look here. Vorg was too worried to bother about minor insults. We couldn't think of putting your worships to too much trouble, he said ingratiatingly. So if you just let us pass, we'll... With surprising speed for one of his years, Pletrac produced a blaster from beneath his grey robes. You'll wait until the transporter arrives, he commanded. Vorg groaned. Well, of course, if your worship puts it that way. Pletrac waved the blaster. You will go back, he ordered. They went back. The plate of the scope was vibrating more fiercely than ever. Since his attempt at self-preservation had failed, Vorg decided he might as well do the decent thing. He sidled up to the doctor. I wouldn't stay too close to the scope if I were you, Doctor. You see, any minute now the drashings are going to... The doctor didn't seem too interested in Vorg's warnings. There you are, old chap. Now listen, I've managed to patch things up a bit, but the life support systems won't hold out for much longer. There's simply too much damage. I need your help. Vorg shied away again. My help? What can I do? I've got to go back inside the scope. What? Are you mad, Doctor? It's the only way I can get my friend out of there, and perhaps save the rest of the livestock as well. Now then, you'll have to trigger the compression and decompression settings for me, right? Vorg tugged agitatedly at his moustache. Trigger the what? He repeated blankly. The doctor stared at him. This is your machine, isn't it? I presume you do know how it works. Dumbly, Vorg shook his head. The doctor looked from Vorg to Sherna, appalled. Sherna said, He won it, Doctor. He won the scope? Yes, that's right, Vorg. It was at the great Wallorian exhibition, you know, about what crazy gamblers those Wallorians are. Well, I had the Magnum pot concession. The doctor ran his fingers through his hair, wondering if the strain was affecting his mind. Magnum pod, he said blankly. Vorg smiled reminiscently. Surely you've seen it, Doctor. The quickness of the hand deceives the eye. See, you take 3 Magnum pods and a Yaris... All right, snapped the doctor. I believe I've seen something similar. You won the scope from a fellow showman, and you don't know how it works. Well, I can manage the basic operating procedure, said Vorg, but as for all this technical stuff... He shook his head sadly. The doctor thought for a moment. This Wallerian you won the scope from, did he give you a blue or green disc about this size? The doctor formed a circle with his finger and thumb. Vorg stroked his moustache. Hard to say. Gave me all sorts of odds and ends, most of them in my old bag there. Vorg fished out a well-worn plastic tool bag and displayed the contents, an amazing assortment of electronic odds and ends. The doctor started sorting through them. What's your plan, Doctor? Asked Sherna. The doctor went on searching and he talked. Well, basically it's very simple. The Omega circuit on the scope is beyond repair, but if I link it to my TARDIS, then I can use that as the master override and reprogram the scope's space-time continuum circuitry. Sherna hadn't understood a word. And what will that do? Two things, I hope. It will expel my friend and myself from inside the scope, and when the scope finally does break down, it will automatically return the other life forms inside to their original space-time coordinates. You mean they'll all go back to where they came from? I sincerely hope so, said the doctor. If my scheme works, they'll arrive at precisely the same point in time at which they left. And you never know what lives have been interrupted, but I must have that Omega bypass disc. Vorg stuck his hand into the bag and pulled out a grimy disc. This what you want? Bit mucky, I'm afraid. Doctor grabbed the disc from him. Thank heavens. Now I'll show you what I want to do. Wait there a moment, will you? He ran over to the TARDIS and disappeared inside. Nearby, Calic and Aurum had noticed the vibrating panel at the bottom of the scope. In his slow-witted way, Oram had been pondering Calic's plan and had spotted a flaw. "It is not possible," he inquired mildly, "that when the... Is it not possible," he inquired mildly, "that when the drashings break out of the scope, one will become oneself involved in the disaster?" Calic said impatiently. "There is certain minimal risk." Oram blinked. "One has to wish to be devoured. One has no wish to be devoured by some alien monstrosity, Calic, even in the cause of political progress." He cheered up. "However, since there seems little sign of the drashings actually will escape, does there not?" Calig pointed to the base panel. The vibration was perceptibly stronger now. Oram shook his head doubtfully. "The outer planets appear to be made of moletic bonded dicilium, and their strength is formidable." "Indeed," snapped Calig. "Then perhaps one should give the drashings a little help." Calig and Oram moved away as the Doctor came out of the TARDIS, playing out lengths of cable and clutching a kind of portable switchboard under one arm. Vorg and Schirner watched him wire the switchboard into the inner workings of the scope. He straightened up. "There," he said. Vorg looked dubiously at the tangle of wires. "Is that it? Doesn't look very safe." "Oh, you'll be all right if you don't touch any bare metal," said the Doctor casually. "Now then, Vorg, I've made it all very simple for you. This is the Phase 1 switch. I'm hoping it will get me into the scope at a point very close to where my friend is. And this is the Phase 2 switch." "Phase 1 switch, Phase 2 switch," muttered Vorg, hoping he could remember all these technicalities. The Doctor gave him a despairing look. "Now concentrate, Vorg. This is important. I'll need all the time I can get once I'm inside. And the Phase 2 switch is the dematerializer, so don't pull the Phase 2 switch until the very last minute, when the scope is about to break down completely. If you pull the switch too early, it just won't work." Vorg nodded, scowling in concentration. "Phase 1 switch. When you tell me, Phase 2 switch at the last minute. Right." Pletrek, who had been waiting suspiciously for some time, came bustling over to them. "What is going on here?" Excitedly, Schirner said. "The Doctor's going back inside the scope to rescue his friend." Pletrek was horrified. "He will do no such thing." He addressed the Doctor sternly. "You have come here illegally. You will be sent to the ICCA for investigation." "What's that?" asked the Doctor. Pletrek had the aggravating suspicion that the alien wasn't really listening to him. Vorg answered the Doctor's question. "The ICCA, the Interconstellations Corrective Authority. You won't like it, Doctor. In other words, it's a prison." "One has no wish to be unduly harsh," said Pletrek, "but people like you must be taught that rules and regulations are made to be observed. You are, it appears, something of a vagabond." The Doctor grinned. "Oh, yes, very much so," he admitted cheerfully. Changing his tone, he snapped. "Now, Vorg, Phase 1. The Doctor leaned as far inside the scope inspection hatch as he could get. Vorg gasped stupidly at him for a moment, then remembering his instructions and spluttering, "Phase 1, Phase 1, leaned over the switchboard and pulled down the Phase 1 switch. The Doctor vanished. Chapter 12. The End of the Scope. Pletrek was enraged by this fresh defiance of his authority. "Stop!" he yelled. "Come back at once!" What really annoyed him was the fact that the Doctor seemed to have disappeared inside an inspection hatch which was obviously too small to hold him. With a flash of childish rage, Pletrek swiped the Doctor's rigged-up switchboard with his blaster. There was a crackle and a flash. Pletrek jumped back, sucking his fingers as the blaster flew from his hand. Vorg and Schirner ran to the switchboard. The Phase 2 switch was a smoking ruin. Vorg sighed. "Well, at least he's back inside. The scope all right," Schirner said. "Maybe he is, but how are we going to get him out?" The Doctor felt a swirling dizziness. He then lost consciousness for a moment as the compression field of the scope sucked him in. He recovered quickly and found himself draped across a broken circuit fairly close to the tunnel that led back to the ship's hold. As he made his way through the interior of the scope, the doctor was shocked to see how quickly damage and deterioration had spread. It was clear that the scope wasn't going to function much longer. He had strictly limited time in which to find Joe. Joe had been waiting in the hold for what seemed like ages. She was beginning to fear the doctor would never come. She sat with her eyes fixed on the octagonal plate in the floor of the hold, willing it to move, but nothing happened. She considered trying to climb through the torn gap left by the drashings, but the climb looked steep and dangerous. There was always the horrid possibility of meeting another drashing on its way up. She wondered how long she could stay down here, undetected. It had taken her only minutes to get the cabin door open, and there had been no one about when she had crossed the deck and climbed down the cargo hatch. She was hoping that when they did discover she was no longer in the cabin, they would search the rest of the ship before trying the cargo hold again. Joe's reveries were interrupted by a metallic sliding sound. She leaned forward. The octagonal panel in the floor was moving back, and to her joy, the head and shoulders of the doctor appeared through it. "Joe," he called. "Joe, are you there?" Sheer relief somehow made Joe irritable. "Well, of course I'm here. I've been here for ages. Where have you been, Doctor?" "No time for questions," said the doctor. "Come on, we've got to get out of here." He led Joe along the same route as before, down the long tube, through the machinery, and towards the sheer drop. Once they arrived, there was only a long climb down, and then they'd be free. In actual fact, they should be free when Vorg pulled the Phase 2 switch. If the doctor's plan worked, they ought to then dematerialize outside the scope. But the doctor wanted to get Joe out before that, if possible, just in case Vorg let him down, or something else went wrong. He had no way of knowing just how badly things had gone wrong already. Urged on by Schöner, Vorg was doing his best, doing his not very competent best to repair the Phase 2 switch. He had never been much of a technician, but as Schöner had pointed out, only the switch was really damaged. The rest of the improvised switchboard was unharmed. And surely a switch was a switch. Vorg seemed all thumbs as he worked, but as her technical knowledge was even less than his, Schöner had no alternative than just to let him get on with it. "How's it going, Vorg?" she asked urgently. "Not long now," he grunted. "Just a few more connections." Schöner took a serrated crystal strip from Vorg's bag. "Is this bit any use?" she asked. Vorg looked up at the strip and stopped working in amazement. "Sure that wasn't there before," he said. Vorg was quite right. Callig had taken advantage of the confusion caused by the doctor's disappearance to toss it in the tool bag. Schöner held up the crystal strip. "What is it then?" "Focusing Trizon for an eradicator gun." Vorg took the little strip and sighed reminiscently. "I've seen one of these for years, not since I served in the old 14th Heavy Lasers. Our battery sergeant was a crustalcoid mercenary, and—" "Never mind the reminiscences," interrupted Schöner. "You just finished repairing the switch. The power's nearly down to critical." Vorg stuffed the strip in his pocket and got back to work. They were almost at the top of the shaft when Joe started slowing down. "Come on, Joe," urged the doctor. "Not much further now." Joe stumbled and fell. "Sorry, Doctor, can't seem to get my breath." Her head fell back. The doctor could feel his own strength flagging. It was getting darker and colder as the scope started to run down, and the air was becoming dangerously thin. The doctor hoisted Joe to his shoulders and staggered on. In the passenger salon, Major Daly looked up from his book. It actually seemed to be cold. Cold? In the tropics? It was getting dark, too. Freak tropical storm, perhaps. Claire ran into the salon. "Daddy, what's happened?" she cried. "I don't feel—" Daly struggled out of his chair. He seemed to take a very long time. Andrews staggered in and stood staring down at Claire. "Give me a hand, old chap," said Daly reprovingly. Poor girl suffering from heat exhaustion. Should never have brought her. He collapsed, slumping backwards in his chair. Andrews knelt beside Claire and tried to lift her. Then he pitched over sideways, falling across her body. The three bodies lay motionless while the little salon grew colder and darker. The doctor staggered along a metal-walled tunnel. Joe on his back. He knew it was hopeless. Even if he reached the rope, he'd never manage to climb down it carrying Joe. As the top of the shaft came in sight, the doctor slumped to his knees, lowering Joe gently to the ground. "The Phase 2 switch, Vogue," he muttered. "Press the Phase 2 switch." He slid forwards on his face. All over the scope, life forms were collapsing. Ogrons, Cybermen, ice warriors. Only the indomitable Drashings hurled themselves time and time again against the base plates. Vorg looked up. "Right," he said. "It's the last connection." Callig and Aurum were at the other side of the scope, watching the vibrating base plate. It was so very nearly free now. They saw Pletrak coming towards them, a spaceport functioning at his side. "Too late, Callig," said Aurum mournfully. "Pletrak is here. The transporter has arrived. There will be no rebellion." Callig could not bear his dreams of power being snatched away, and all for want of a few more seconds. "Aurum," he ordered, "go and delay Pletrak. I don't care what you have to say to him, just delay him." Aurum was dubious but obedient as always. One will do one's best." As Aurum moved to intercept Pletrak, Callig grabbed a crowbar from Vorg's toolkit and began prizing it at the base plate of the scope. Busily finishing the last switch connection, it took Vorg a moment to notice him. Then, suddenly, seeing what Callig was doing, Vorg rushed round to the scope. "Stop that!" he yelled. "You want to get us all killed?" Callig, his face a fanatical mask, produced his blaster. "Get back, or you'll be killed now," he snarled. Covering Vorg with the blaster, he prized away at the scope one-handed. Aurum was trying to think of reasons to delay Pletrak, but his imagination had never been his strong point. For the last time, the special transporter was delayed by a refusal of engineering functionaries to work double shifts, said Pletrak pettishly. "Now will you please get out of my way?" He sidestepped past Aurum and immediately saw what Callig was doing. Just as Callig succeeded in prizing loose a corner of the base plate, the Drashig grew so close it seemed to materialize from thin air. Once at its full, terrifying size, its neck swung around, its teeth gnashed. It let out a terrifying bellow at the scent of so much edible flesh in one place. Knocking Aurum aside, Pletrak ran to the Eradicator. Seizing the controls, he swung it round and fired. Nothing happened. "Sabotage! Run for your lives!" Pletrak screamed. The advice was unnecessary. Everyone in the spaceport was already running. Callig sprinted across the spaceport, Drashig at his heels, its claws scrabbling at the smooth floor. Callig stumbled and rolled over. The Drashig's head swooped down and Callig swung wildly with the crowbar, and the Drashig ate him, crowbar and all. Its appetite barely whetted, the Drashig swung round in quest of more prey. Shurna stood beside the scope, too terrified to move. The Drashig bore down on her. Afterwards, Vorg could never understand how he managed to move so quickly. He'd watched everything in bemused amazement, Callig prizing off the plate, the Drashig materializing, Pletrak's attempt to use the Eradicator, Callig's sudden and horrible death. All at once Vorg realized what he had to do. Grabbing Shurna by the hand, he dragged her across to the Eradicator. Thrusting her down behind it for shelter, jumping into the control sheet, he took the Trizon focuser from his pocket, slid it into the mechanism and swung round the Eradicator nozzle and fired. But now the Drashig was almost upon them, and the full blast of the Eradicator beam took it straight between the slavering jaws. The Drashig bellowed, glowed bright red, then disappeared completely, integrated by the Eradicator beam. There was another fearsome bellow and Vorg saw a second Drashig bearing down on him. With calm professionalism, Vorg swung the Eradicator onto the new target and pressed the firing button. One by one, the Drashings came from the machine, shooting up to full size. One by one, Vorg blasted them into nothingness. When the last monster was disposed of, Vorg stepped down from the gun, dusting his hands together. "Well," he said casually, "that's that." Shona straightened up, looking at this new heroic Vorg with unbelieving eyes. Suddenly she shouted, "Don't stand there preening yourself, Vorg. What about the doctor?" They ran across to the scope. Vorg looked at the dials, all flickering at their lowest readings. "It's too late," he said sadly. "I finished repairing the switch, but there's no power to work it." "At least we can try," said Shona. Vorg threw the switch. "It's no use. Power's completely gone." He paused, listening. No, wait a minute. A faint hum of power was coming through the doctor's keyboard. It grew in strength as the failing scope was able to draw power from the TARDIS console. Slowly the power hum began to build till the scope was vibrating with energy. In the misty swamp, a Drashig raised its head, bellowed, and vanished. The prostrate bodies of Major Daly, his daughter Claire, and young Lieutenant Andrews faded quietly away from the salon of the SS Bernice. All over the scope, in all the different circuits, Ogrons, Cybermen, Ice Warriors, and a variety of other life forms faded away to reappear back on their original planets. Deep inside the machinery of the scope, the bodies of Joe and the Doctor dematerialized, to appear in the spaceport of Intermina, sprawled at the base of the TARDIS just as the Doctor had planned. They recovered consciousness to find a delighted Vorg and Shona standing over them. Helped by the two Lermans, Joe and the Doctor got to their feet. Vorg shook the Doctor enthusiastically by the hand. "It worked, Doctor, it worked!" he shouted. The Doctor grinned. "So I see. You cut it a bit fine, didn't you?" Vorg gave a modest smile. "Well, as a matter of fact, Doctor, we had a little trouble here, but I dealt with it." Vorg recovered to find the Doctor and a lot of oddly dressed strangers smiling down at her. The Doctor lifted her to his feet. "It's all right, Joe. We made it." He pointed to the TARDIS just behind them. Joe gave a sigh of relief. "What about all the others, though?" she asked. "The people on the ship?" The Doctor was putting on his coat. "They're all right, too. I reversed the scope's original settings and linked them to the TARDIS. They should all be back on their ship. The real ship this time, the real SS Bernice, sailing the real Indian Ocean back in the year 1926. The Doctor nodded. "Exactly." Joe smiled. "I'm glad about that. I grew quite fond of them, and quite fond of them all in the end. Won't that mean changing history, though?" The Doctor waved his hand airily. "Oh, only a few small minor. Only in a few small details." Propped up in his bunk, Major Daly finished the last page of his book. There was a tap on the cabin door, and his daughter Claire came in. "It's only me. Come to say good night." Daly yawned. "I've been reading," he said sleepily. "Actually managed to finish my book. Seems like the longest one I've ever read." Claire nodded, gazing through the porthole at the setting sun. "That seemed to have been a long trip somehow." Daly tapped his book. "Disappointing ending. Chap decided to become a missionary. I thought he'd marry the girl." Claire smiled. "You're an old romantic, Daly. Bet you all your stories about the East are just romances." "See for yourself soon. Bombay tomorrow." Claire stood up. "Really looking forward to that." Daly smiled slightly. "Not sure young Andrews is. He wouldn't care how long this trip lasted." Claire laughed. "That's what I mean. You're a romantic." "Good night, Daly." She kissed his cheek and then went out of the cabin. Daly yawned. He reached out for his calendar and crossed off the last day of the voyage. Then settled down to sleep. As he was drifting off, strange pictures floated through his mind. He heard the roar of guns, the bellowing of monsters. There was something about a tall, white-haired man and a small girl with fair hair. Stowaways. Daly couldn't make any sense of it. Must be jumbled memories of some blood and thunder story he'd read a long time ago. Soon he was peacefully asleep. The SS Bernice steamed steadily towards Bombay. Surrounded by an admiring audience of officials and functionaries, Vorg was telling the story of his valour for the 100th time, and then came the second drashing. Barrelling in at 90 degrees, it was so close I could feel its breath, so I swung like this, see, and gave a quick burst. And then the third, and I got that one with a snapshot. Indeed, we are all very grateful, interrupted Pletrek politely. Your valour will long be remembered. Well, if he has anything to do with it, muttered Schöner. Think nothing of it, Vorg was saying. As an old soldier, it's my natural reaction to stand and fight. Well, as I was saying, the doctor tapped Pletrek gently on the shoulder. I think it's time we were leaving. Pletrek was horrified. Out of the question. You must all stay for the cause of inquiry. Orm has confessed he and Kalek plotted to discredit our president, and they sabotaged the Eradicator and aided the Drashings to escape. Well, there you are then, said Joe. You've got a confession. You don't need an inquiry. One must observe the correct procedures, said Pletrek. Doctor gave Joe a warning nudge. They're very hot on correct procedures here, Joe. Better not argue. It's a waste of time. Pletrek gave a satisfied nod. At last the alien was learning correct behaviour. Joe gave the doctor an understanding smile. They started edging towards the TARDIS. Pletrek turned his attention back towards Vorg. President Tsar will no doubt wish to reward your valour with some appropriate decoration. A medal, said Vorg happily. How very kind. Schöner nudged him. We can't eat medals, Vorg. How are you going to live now the scope's just a heap of old junk? Vorg gave a confident smile. Just you leave that to me, my dear. The doctor opened the TARDIS. Vorg was turning to Pletrek. Now then, old fellow, I'm going to show you a little game. Pletrek gave a puzzled look. What is a game? Vorg was arranging 3 polished pods on top of a crate. They were circular and hollow, like little wooden cups. He turned them upside down and produced a bright blue seed, holding it between finger and thumb. Now, you see these 3 magnum pods? I'm going to put this yarrow seed underneath the middle one, right? Pletrek nodded, completely baffled. Then, said Vorg in a hypnotic voice, I move the magnum pods about very slowly, like so. Now, which one is the seed under? There is no possible doubt, said Pletrek unhesitatingly. This one. Quite right, said Vorg encouragingly, lifting up the pod. Now then, care to try that again? How about a little wager, just to add interest? He replaced the seed and moved the pods about. Very well, said Pletrek obligingly. I will wager 1 credit bar that the seed is under this one. He was wrong. Pletrek was indignant. We shall play again, he said. He insisted. One was too hasty. One will not be mistaken a second time. Another small wager, suggested Vorg casually. Increase the stake a bit. Pletrek frowned. It was intolerable that he, a senior official of the Interminor, should be bested in such a simple game. Most certainly, he said. One will wager 5, no, 10 credit bars. One's judgment is correct. Vorg beamed and winked at Schöner. I think I'm going to like it here, Pletrek, old fellow. I can see you Minorians are great sportsmen. You remind me of the Wallorians. Joe had been watching in fascination. The doctor tapped her on the shoulder. Time to be off. Time to be off, Joe. He smiled. No need to worry about Vorg, is there? He'll probably end up president. That or chance with the Exchequer, agreed the doctor. They slipped inside the TARDIS. It caused another mild panic when the TARDIS dematerialized. Officials and functionaries jumped back in alarm. Schöner smiled rather tearfully and waved goodbye. Commissioner Pletrek didn't even notice. He was trying to work out how he'd managed to pick the wrong magnum pod. Yet again. And there endeth the book. A wonderfully fine tome by Terrance Dicks. And thank you all for watching. I'm going to join all these videos together and post them to YouTube. Goodbye.